Chapter 39 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 39. All night did Winterborne think over that unsatisfactory ending of a pleasant time, forgetting the pleasant time itself. He feared anew that they could never be happy together, even should she be free to choose him. She was accomplished, he was unrefined. It was the original difficulty, which he was too sensitive to recklessly ignore, as some men would have done in his place. He was one of those silent, unobtrusive beings who want little from others in the way of favour or condescension, and perhaps on that very account scrutinize those others' behaviour too closely. He was not versatile, but one in whom a hope or belief which had once had its rise, meridian, and decline seldom again exactly recurred, as in the breasts of more sanguine mortals. He had once worshipped her, laid out his life to suit her, wooed her, and lost her. Though it was with almost the same zest, it was not with quite the same hope that he had begun to tread the old tracks again, and allowed himself to be so charmed with her that day. Move another step towards her he would not. He would even repulse her as a tribute to conscience. It would be sheer sin to let her prepare a pitfall for her happiness, not much smaller than the first, by inveigling her into a union with such as he. Her poor father was now blind to these subtleties, which he had formerly beheld as in noontide light. It was his own duty to declare them for her dear sake. Grace, too, had a very uncomfortable night, and her solicitous embarrassment was not lessened the next morning when another letter from her father was put into her hands. Its tenor was an intenser strain of the one that had preceded it. After stating how extremely glad he was to hear that she was better, and able to get out of doors, he went on. "This is a wearisome business, the solicitor we have come to see being out of town. I do not know when I shall get home. My great anxiety in this delay is still lest you should lose Giles Winterborne. I cannot rest at night for thinking that while our business is hanging fire he may become estranged, or go away from the neighbourhood. I have set my heart upon seeing him your husband, if you ever have another. Do then, Grace, give him some temporary encouragement, even though it is over early. For when I consider the past, I do think that God will forgive me and you for being a little forward. I have another reason for this, my dear. I feel myself going rapidly downhill, and late affairs have still further helped me that way. And until this thing is done, I cannot rest in peace." He added a postscript. "I have just heard that the solicitor is to be seen tomorrow. Possibly, therefore, I shall return in the evening, after you get this." The paternal longing ran on all fours with her own desire, and yet in forwarding it yesterday she had been on the brink of giving offence. While craving to be a country girl again, just as her father requested, to put off the old Eve, the fastidious Miss, or rather Madam, completely, her first attempt had been beaten by the unexpected vitality of that fastidiousness. Her father, on returning and seeing the trifling coolness of Giles, would be sure to say that the same perversity which had led her to make difficulties about marrying Fitzpiers was now prompting her to blow hot and cold with poor Winterborne. If the latter had been the most subtle hand at touching the stops of her delicate soul, instead of one who had just bound himself to let her drift away from him again, if she would, on the wind of her estranging education, he could not have acted more seductively than he did that day. He chanced to be superintending some temporary work in a field opposite her windows. She could not discover what he was doing, but she read his mood keenly and truly. She could see in his coming and going an air of determined abandonment on the whole landscape that lay in her direction. Oh, how she longed to make it up with him! Her father coming in the evening, which meant, she supposed, that all formalities would be in train, her marriage virtually annulled, and she be free to be one again. How could she look him in the face if he should see them estranged thus? It was a fair green evening in June. She was seated in the garden in the rustic chair which stood under the laurel bushes, made of peeled oak branches that came to Melbury's premises as refuse after barking time. The mass of full-juiced leafage on the heights around her was just swayed into faint gestures by a nearly spent wind which, even in its enfeebled state, did not reach her shelter. All day she had expected Giles to call, to inquire how she had got home, or something or other, but he had not come. And he still tantalized her by going athwart and across that orchard opposite. She could see him as she sat. A slight diversion was presently created by Creedle bringing him a letter. She knew from this that Creedle had just come from Sherton, and had called as usual at the post office for anything that had arrived by the afternoon post, of which there was no delivery at Hintock. She pondered on what the letter might contain, particularly whether it were a second refresher for Winterborne from her father, like her own of the morning. But it appeared to have no bearing upon herself whatever. Giles read its contents, and almost immediately turned away to a gap in the hedge of the orchard, if that could be called a hedge, which, owing to the dripping of the trees, was little more than a bank with a bush upon it here and there. He entered the plantation, and was no doubt going that way homeward to the mysterious hut he occupied on the other side of the woodland. The sad sands were running swiftly through time's glass. She had often felt it in these latter days, and like Giles she felt it doubly now after the solemn and pathetic reminder in her father's communication. Her freshness would pass. The long-suffering devotion of Giles might suddenly end, might end that very hour. Men were so strange. The thought took away from her all her former reticence, and made her action bold. She started from her seat. If the little breach, quarrel, or whatever it might be called, of yesterday was to be healed up, it must be done by her on the instant. She crossed the orchard and clambered through the gap after Giles, just as he was diminishing to a fawn-like figure under the green canopy and over the brown floor. Grace had been wrong, very far wrong, in assuming that the letter had no reference to herself because Giles had turned away into the wood after its perusal. It was, sad to say, because the missive had so much reference to herself that he had thus turned away. He feared that his grieved discomfiture might be observed. The letter was from Beaucock, written a few hours later than Melbury's to his daughter. It announced failure. Giles had once done that thriftless man a good turn, and now was the moment when Beaucock had chosen to remember it in his own way. During his absence in town with Melbury, the lawyer's clerk had naturally heard a great deal of the timber merchant's family scheme of justice to Giles, and his communication was to inform Winterborne at the earliest possible moment that their attempt had failed, in order that the young man should not place himself in a false position towards Grace in the belief of its coming success. The news was, in sum, that Fitzpiers's conduct had not been sufficiently cruel to Grace to enable her to snap the bond. She was apparently doomed to be his wife till the end of the chapter. Winterborne quite forgot his superficial differences with the poor girl under the warm rush of deep and distracting love for her which the almost tragical information engendered. To renounce her for ever, that was then the end of it for him, after all. There was no longer any question of its suitability, or room for tiffs on petty tastes. The curtain had fallen again between them. She could not be his. The cruelty of their late revived hope was now terrible. How could they all have been so simple as to suppose this thing could be done? It was at this moment that, hearing someone coming behind him, he turned and saw her hastening on between the thickets. He perceived in an instant that she did not know the blighting news. "Giles, why didn't you come across to me?" she asked, with arch reproach. "Didn't you see me sitting there ever so long?" "Oh, yes," he said in unprepared extemporized tones, for her unexpected presence caught him without the slightest plan of behaviour in the conjecture. His manner made her think that she had been too chiding in her speech, and a mild scarlet wave passed over her as she resolved to soften it. "I have had another letter from my father," she hastened to continue. "He thinks he may come home this evening, and, in view of his hopes, it will grieve him if there is any little difference between us, Giles." "There is none," he said, sadly regarding her from the face downwards as he pondered how to lay the cruel truth bare. Still, I fear you have not quite forgiven me about my being uncomfortable at the inn." "I have, Grace, I am sure." "But you speak in quite an unhappy way," she returned, coming up close to him with the most winning of the many pretty airs that appertained to her. "Don't you think you will ever be happy, Giles?" He did not reply for some instants. "When the sun shines on the north front of Sherton Abbey, that's when my happiness will come to me," said he, staring as it were into the earth. "But then that means there is something more than my offending you in not liking the 3 tons. If it is because I did not like to let you kiss me at the Abbey, well, you know, Giles, it was not on account of my cold feelings, but because I did certainly just then think it was rather premature, in spite of my poor father. That was the true reason, the sole one. But I do not want to be hard. God knows I do not," she said, her voice fluctuating. "And perhaps as I am on the verge of freedom, I am not right, after all, in thinking there is any harm in your kissing me." "Oh, God!" said Winterborne within himself. His head was turned askance, and he still resolutely regarded the ground. For the last several minutes he had seen this great temptation approaching him in regular siege, and now it had come. The wrong, the social sin, of now taking advantage of the offer of her lips had a magnitude, in the eyes of one whose life had been so primitive, so ruled by the purest household laws as Giles's, which can hardly be explained. "Did you say anything?" she asked timidly. "Oh, no, only that—" "You mean that it must be settled, since my father is coming home," she said gladly. Winterborne, though fighting valiantly against himself all this while, though he would have protected Grace's good repute as the apple of his eye, was a man, and, as Desdemona said, men are not gods. In face of the agonizing seductiveness shown by her, in her unenlightened schoolgirl simplicity about the laws and ordinances, he betrayed a man's weakness. Since it was so, since it had come to this, that Grace, deeming herself free to do it, was virtually asking him to demonstrate that he loved her, since he could demonstrate it only too truly, since life was short and love was strong, he gave way to the temptation, notwithstanding that he perfectly well knew her to be wedded irrevocably to Fitzpiers. Indeed, he cared nothing for the past or future, simply accepting the present and what it brought, desiring once in his life to clasp in his arms her he had watched over and loved so long. She started back suddenly from his embrace, influenced by a sort of inspiration. "Oh, I suppose," she stammered, "that I am really free, that this is right. Is there really a new law? Father cannot have been too sanguine in saying—" He did not answer, and a moment afterwards Grace burst into tears, in spite of herself. "Oh, why does not my father come home and explain?" she sobbed, "and let me know clearly what I am. It is too trying, this, to ask me to, and then to leave me so long in so vague a state that I do not know what to do, and perhaps do wrong." Winterborne felt like a very Cain, over and above his previous sorrow. He had sinned against her in not telling her what he knew. He turned aside. The feeling of his cruelty mounted higher and higher. How could he have dreamed of kissing her? He could hardly refrain from tears. Surely nothing more pitiable had ever been known than the condition of this poor young thing, now as heretofore the victim of her father's well-meant but blundering policy. Even in the hour of Melbury's greatest assurance, Winterborne had harboured a suspicion that no law, new or old, could undo Grace's marriage without her appearance in public, though he was not sufficiently sure of what might have been enacted to destroy by his own words her pleasing idea that a mere dash of the pen, on her father's testimony, was going to be sufficient. But he had never suspected the sad fact that the position would be irremediable. Poor Grace, perhaps feeling that she had indulged in too much fluster for a mere kiss, calmed herself at finding how grave he was. "I am glad we are friends again, anyhow," she said, smiling through her tears. "Giles, if you had only shown half the boldness before I married, that you show now, you would have carried me off for your own first instead of second. If we do marry, I hope you will never think badly of me for encouraging you a little. But my father is so impatient, you know, as his years of infirmities increase, that he will wish to see us a little advanced when he comes. That is my only excuse." To Winterborne all this was sadder than it was sweet. How could she so trust her father's conjectures? He did not know how to tell her the truth and shame himself, and yet he felt it must be done. "We may have been wrong," he began, almost fearfully, "in supposing that I can be carried out while we stay here at Hintock. I am not sure but that people may have to appear in public court even under the new Act, and if there should be any difficulty, and we cannot marry after all—" Her cheeks became slowly bloodless. "Oh, Giles," she said, grasping his arm, "you have heard something. What, cannot my father conclude it there and now? Surely he has done it. Oh, Giles, Giles, don't deceive me. What terrible position am I in?" He could not tell her, try as he would. The sense of her implicit trust in his honour absolutely disabled him. "I cannot inform you," he murmured, his voice husky as that of the leaves underfoot. "Your father will soon be here. Then we shall know. I will take you home." Inexpressibly dear as she was to him, he offered her his arm with the most reserved air, as he added correctingly, "I will take you at any rate into the drive." Thus they walked on together, Grace vibrating between happiness and misgiving. It was only a few minutes' walk to where the drive ran, and they had hardly descended into it when they heard a voice behind them cry, "Take out that arm!" For a moment they did not heed, and the voice repeated more loudly and hoarsely, "Take out that arm!" It was Melbury's. He had returned sooner than they expected, and now came up to them. Grace's hand had been withdrawn like lightning on her hearing the second command. "I don't blame you, I don't blame you," he said, in the weary cadence of one broken down with scourgings. "But you two must walk together no more. I have been surprised. I have been cruelly deceived. Giles, don't say anything to me, but go away." He was evidently not aware that Winterborne had known the truth before he brought it, and Giles would not stay to discuss it with him then. When the young man had gone, Melbury took his daughter indoors to the room he used as his office. There he sat down and bent over the slope of the bureau, her bewildered gaze fixed upon him. When Melbury had recovered a little, he said, "You are now, as ever, Fitzpiers's wife. I was deluded. He has not done you enough harm. You are still subject to his beck and call." "Then let it be, and never mind, father," she said with dignified sorrow. "I can bear it. It is your trouble that grieves me most." She stooped over him and put her arm round his neck, which distressed Melbury still more. "I don't mind at all what comes to me," Grace continued, "whose wife I am or whose I am not. I do love Giles, I cannot help that, and I have gone further with him than I should have done if I had known exactly how things were, but I do not reproach you." "Then Giles did not tell you?" said Melbury. "No," she said. "He could not have known it. His behaviour to me proved that he did not know." Her father said nothing more, and Grace went away to the solitude of her chamber. Her heavy disquietude had many shapes, and for a time she put aside the dominant fact to think of her too free conduct towards Giles. His love-making had been brief as it was sweet. But would he, on reflection, contemn her for forwardness? How could she have been so simple as to suppose she was in a position to behave as she had done? Thus she mentally blamed her ignorance, and yet in the centre of her heart she blessed it a little for what it had momentarily brought her. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 40. Life among the people involved in these events seemed to be suppressed and hidebound for a while. Grace seldom showed herself outside the house, never outside the garden, for she feared she might encounter Giles Winterborne, and that she could not bear. This pensive intramural existence of the self-constituted nun appeared likely to continue for an indefinite time. She had learned that there was one possibility in which her formerly imagined position might become real, and only one, that her husband's absence should continue long enough to amount to positive desertion. But she never allowed her mind to dwell much upon the thought, still less did she deliberately hope for such a result. Her regard for Winterborne had been rarefied by the shock which followed its avowal to an ethereal emotion that had little to do with living and doing. As for Giles, he was lying, or rather sitting, ill at his hut. A feverish indisposition which had been hanging about him for some time, the result of a chill caught the previous winter, seemed to acquire virulence with the prostration of his hopes. But not a soul knew of his languor, and he did not think the case serious enough to send for a medical man. After a few days he was better again, and crept about his home in a great coat, attending to his simple wants as usual with his own hands. So matters stood when the limpid inertia of Grace's pool-like existence was disrupted, as by a geyser. She received a letter from Fitzpiers. Such a terrible letter it was in its import, though couched in the gentlest language. In his absence Grace had grown to regard him with toleration, and her relation to him with equanimity, till she had almost forgotten how trying his presence would be. He wrote briefly and unaffectedly. He made no excuses, but informed her that he was living quite alone, that he had been led to think that they ought to be together, if she would make up her mind to forgive him. He therefore purported to cross the Channel to Budmouth by the steamer on the day he named, which she found to be 3 days after the time of her present reading. He said that he could not come to Hintock for obvious reasons, which her father would understand even better than herself. As the only alternative, she was to be on the quay to meet the steamer when it arrived from the opposite coast, probably about half an hour before midnight, bringing with her any luggage she might require, join him there, and pass with him into the twin vessel, which left immediately on the other entering the harbour, returning thus with him to his continental dwelling-place, which he did not name. He had no intention of showing himself on land at all. The troubled Grace took the letter to her father, who now continued for long hours by the fireless summer chimney-corner, as if he thought it were winter, the pitcher of cider standing beside him, mostly untasted and coated with a film of dust. After reading it he looked up. "You shan't go," said he. "I had felt I would not," she answered, "but I did not know what you would say." "If he comes and lives in England, not too near here and in a respectable way, and wants you to come to him, I'm not sure that I'll oppose him in wishing it," muttered Melbury. "I'd stint myself to keep you both in a genteel and seemly style, but go abroad you never shall with my consent." There the question rested that day. Grace was unable to reply to her husband in the absence of an address, and the morrow came, and the next day, and the evening on which he had requested her to meet him. Throughout the whole of it she remained within the 4 walls of her room. The sense of her harassment, carking doubt of what might be impending, hung like a cowl of blackness over the Melbury household. They spoke almost in whispers, and wondered what Fitzpiers would do next. It was the hope of every one that, finding she did not arrive, he would return again to France, and as for Grace, she was willing to write to him on the most kindly terms if he would only keep away. The night passed, Grace lying tense and wide awake, and her relatives in great part likewise. When they met the next morning they were pale and anxious, though neither speaking of the subject which occupied all their thoughts. The day passed as quietly as the previous ones, and she began to think that, in the rank caprice of his moods, he had abandoned the idea of getting her to join him as quickly as it was formed. All on a sudden some person who had just come from Sherton entered the house with news that Mr. Fitzpiers was on his way home to Hintock. He had been seen hiring a carriage at the Earl of Wessex Hotel. Her father and Grace were both present when the intelligence was announced. "Now," said Melbury, "we must make the best of what has been a very bad matter. The man is repenting. The partner of his shame, I hear, is gone away from him to Switzerland, so that chapter of his life is probably over. If he chooses to make a home for ye, I think you should not say him nay, Grace. Certainly he cannot very well live at Hintock without a blow to his pride. But if he can bear that, and likes Hintock best, why, there's the empty wing of the house as it was before." "Oh, father," said Grace, turning white with dismay. "Why not?" he said, a little of his former doggedness returning. He was in truth disposed to somewhat more leniency towards her husband just now than he had shown formerly, from a conviction that he had treated him over roughly in his anger. "Surely it is the most respectable thing to do," he continued. "I don't like this state that you are in, neither married nor single. It hurts me, and it hurts you, and it will always be remembered against us in Hintock. There has never been any scandal like it in the family before." "He will be here in less than an hour," murmured Grace. The twilight of the room prevented her father seeing the despondent misery of her face. The one tolerable condition, the condition she had deprecated above all others, was that of Fitzpiers's reinstatement there. "Oh, I won't see him," she said, sinking down. She was almost hysterical. "Try if you cannot," he returned moodily. "Oh yes, I will," she went on inconsequently. "I'll try," and jumping up suddenly she left the room. In the darkness of the apartment to which she flew nothing could have been seen during the next half hour, but from a corner a quick breathing was audible from this impressible creature, who combined modern nerves with primitive emotions, and was doomed by such coexistence to be numbered among the distress, and to take her scourgings to their exquisite extremity. The window was open. On this quiet late summer evening, whatever sound arose in so secluded a district, the chirp of a bird, a call from a voice, the turning of a wheel, extended over bush and tree to unwonted distances. Very few sounds did arise, but as Grace invisibly breathed in the brown glooms of the chamber, the small remote noise of light wheels came into her, accompanied by the trot of a horse on the turnpike road. There seemed to be a sudden hitch or pause in the progress of the vehicle, which was what first drew her attention to it. She knew the point whence the sound proceeded, the hilltop over which travellers passed on their way hitherward from Sherton Abbas, the place at which she had emerged from the wood with Mrs. Charmond. Grace slid along the floor, and bent her head over the window-sill, listening with open lips. The carriage had stopped, and she heard a man use exclamatory words. Then another said, "What the devil is the matter with the horse?" She recognized the voice as her husband's. The accident, such as it had been, was soon remedied, and the carriage could be heard descending the hill on the Hintock side, soon to turn into the lane leading out of the highway, and then into the drong, which led out of the lane to the house where she was. A spasm passed through Grace. The Daphnean instinct, exceptionally strong in her as a girl, had been revived by her widowed seclusion, and it was not lessened by her affronted sentiments toward the comer, and her regard for another man. She opened some little ivory tablets that lay on her dressing-table, scribbled in pencil on one of them, "I am gone to visit one of my school friends," gathered a few toilet necessities into a hand-bag, and not 3 minutes after that voice had been heard, her slim form, hastily wrapped up from observation, might have been seen passing out of the back door of Melbury's house. Thence she skimmed up the garden path, through a gap in the hedge, and into the mossy cart-track under the trees which led into the depth of the woods. The leaves overhead were now in their latter green, so opaque that it was darker at some of the densest spots than in winter-time, scarce a crevice existing by which a ray of light could get down to the ground. But in open places she could see well enough. Summer was ending. In the daytime singing insects hung in every sunbeam. Vegetation was heavy nightly with globes of dew, and after showers creeping damps and twilight chills came up from the hollows. The plantations were always weird at this hour of the eve, more spectral far than in the leafless season, where there were fewer masses and more minute lineality. The smooth surfaces of glossy plants came out like weak, lidless eyes. There were strange faces and figures from expiring lights that had somehow wandered into the canopied obscurity, while now and then low peeps of the sky between the trunks were like sheeted shapes, and on the tips of boughs sat faint cloven tongues. But Grace's fear just now was not imaginative or spiritual, and she heeded these impressions but little. She went on as silently as she could, avoiding the hollows wherein leaves had accumulated, and stepping upon soundless moss and grass tufts. She paused breathlessly once or twice, and fancied that she could hear, above the beat of her strumming pulse, the vehicle containing Fitzpiers turning in at the gate of her father's premises. She hastened on again. The Hintock woods owned by Mrs. Charmond were presently left behind, and those into which she next plunged were divided from the latter by a bank, from whose top the hedge had long ago perished, starved for want of the sun. It was with some caution that Grace now walked, though she was quite free from any of the commonplace timidities of her ordinary pilgrimages to such spots. She feared no lurking harms, but that her effort would be all in vain, and her return to the house rendered imperative. She had walked between 3 and 4 miles when that prescriptive comfort of relief to wanderers in the woods, a distant light, broke at last upon her searching eyes. It was so very small as to be almost sinister to a stranger, but to her it was what she sought. She pushed forward, and the dim outline of a dwelling was disclosed. The house was a square cot of only 1 story, sloping up on all sides to a chimney in the midst. It had formerly been the home of a charcoal burner, in times when that fuel was still used in the county houses. Its only appurtenance was a paled enclosure, there being no garden, the shade of the trees preventing the growth of vegetables. She advanced to the window whence the rays of light proceeded, and the shutters being as yet unclosed, she could survey the whole interior through the panes. The room within was a kitchen, parlour, and scullery all in one. The natural sandstone floor was worn into hills and dales by long treading, so that none of the furniture stood level, and the table slanted like a desk. A fire burned in the hearth, in front of which revolved the skinned carcass of a rabbit suspended by a string from a nail. Leaning with one arm on the mantel-shelf stood Winterborne, his eyes on the roasting animal, his face so rapt that speculation could build nothing in it concerning his thoughts, more than that they were not with the scene before him. She thought his features had changed a little since she saw him last. The firelight did not enable her to perceive that they were positively haggard. Grace's throat emitted a gasp of relief at finding the result so nearly as she had hoped. She went to the door and tapped lightly. He seemed to be accustomed to the noises of woodpeckers, squirrels, and such small creatures, for he took no notice of her tiny signal, and she knocked again. This time he came and opened the door. When the light of the room fell upon her face, he started, and, hardly knowing what she did, crossed the threshold to her, placing his hands upon her 2 arms, while surprise, joy, alarm, sadness chased through him by turns. With Grace it was the same. Even in this stress there was the fond fact that they had met again. Thus they stood, long tears upon their faces, waxen white, with extreme sad delight. He broke the silence by saying in a whisper, "Come in." "No, Giles, no," she answered hurriedly, stepping yet further back from the door. "I am passing by, and I have called on you. I won't enter. Will you help me? I am afraid. I want to get by a roundabout way to Sherton, and so to Exonbury. I have a schoolfellow there, but I cannot get to Sherton alone. Oh, if you will only accompany me a little way! Don't condemn me, Giles, and be offended. I was obliged to come to you because I have no other help here. 3 months ago you were my lover, now you are my only friend. The law has stepped in and forbidden what we thought of. It must not be. but we can act honestly, and yet you can be my friend for one little hour. I have no other." She could get no further. Covering her eyes with one hand, by an effort of repression she wept a silent trickle, without sigh or sob. Winterborne took her hand. "What has happened?" he said. "He has come." There was a stillness as of death till Winterborne asked, "You mean this, Grace, that I am to help you get away?" "Yes," she said. "Appearance is no matter, when the reality is right. I have said to myself I can trust you." Giles knew from this that she did not suspect his treachery, if it could be called such, earlier in the summer, when they met for the last time as lovers, and in the intensity of his contrition for that tender wrong he determined to deserve her faith now at least, and so wipe out that reproach from his conscience. "I'll come at once," he said. "I'll light a lantern." He unhooked a dark lantern from a nail under the eaves, and she did not notice how his hand shook with a slight strain, or dream that in making this offer he was taxing a convalescent. Chapter 41 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 41. The first 100 yards of their course lay under motionless trees, whose upper foliage began to hiss with falling drops of rain. By the time that they emerged upon a glade it rained heavily. "This is awkward," said Grace with an effort to hide her concern. Winterborne stopped. "Grace," he said, preserving a strictly business manner which belied him, "you cannot go to Sherton tonight." "But I must." "Why? It is 9 miles from here. It is almost an impossibility in this rain." "True. Why?" she murmured, mournfully, at the end of a silence. "What is reputation to me?" "Now hearken," said Giles. "You won't go back to your—" "No, no, no! Don't make me!" she cried piteously. "Then let us turn." They slowly retraced their steps, and again stood before his door. "Now, this house from this moment is yours, and not mine," he said deliberately. "I have a place near by where I can stay very well." Her face had drooped. "Oh," she murmured as she saw the dilemma, "what have I done?" There was a smell of something burning within, and he looked through the window. The rabbit that he had been cooking to coax a weak appetite was beginning to char. "Please go in and attend to it," he said. "Do what you like. Now I leave. You'll find everything about the hut that is necessary." "But, Giles, your supper!" she exclaimed. "An outhouse would do for me. Anything, till tomorrow at daybreak." He signified a negative. "I tell you to go in. You may catch agues out here in your delicate state. You can give me my supper through the window if you feel well enough. I'll wait a while." He gently urged her to pass the doorway, and was relieved when he saw her within the room sitting down. Without so much as crossing the threshold himself, he closed the door upon her, and turned the key in the lock. Tapping at the window, he signified that she should open the casement, and when she had done this he handed in the key to her. "You are locked in," he said, "and your own mistress." Even in her trouble she could not refrain from a faint smile at his scrupulousness as she took the door key. "Do you feel better?" he went on. "If so, and you wish to give me some of your supper, please do. If not, it's of no importance. I can get some elsewhere." The grateful sense of his kindness stirred her to action, though she only knew half of what that kindness really was. At the end of some 10 minutes she again came to the window, pushed it open, and said in a whisper, "Giles!" He at once emerged from the shade, and saw that she was preparing to hand him his share of the meal upon a plate. "I don't like to treat you so hardly," she murmured with deep regret in her words as she heard the rain pattering on the leaves. But I suppose it is best to arrange like this." "Oh yes," he said quickly. "I feel that I could never have reached Sherton." "It was impossible." "Are you sure you have a snug place out there?" with renewed misgiving. "Quite. Have you found everything you want? I'm afraid it is rather rough accommodation." "I can notice no defects. I have long passed that stage, and you know it, Giles, or you ought to." His eyes sadly contemplated her face as its pale responsiveness modulated through a crowd of expressions that showed only too clearly to what a pitch she was strung. If ever Winterborne's heart fretted his bosom, it was at this sight of a perfectly defenceless creature conditioned by such circumstances. He forgot his own agony in the satisfaction of having at least found her a shelter. He took his plate and cup from her hand, saying, "Now, I'll push the shutter to, and you will find an iron pin on the inside, which you must fix into the bolt. Do not stir in the morning till I come and call you." She expressed an alarmed hope that he would not go very far away. "Oh no, I shall be quite within hail," said Winterborne. She bolted the window as directed, and he retreated. His snug place proved to be a wretched little shelter of the roughest kind, formed of 4 hurdles thatched with brake fern. Underneath were dry sticks, hay, and other litter of the sort, upon which he sat down, and there in the dark tried to eat his meal. But his appetite was quite gone. He pushed the plate aside and shook up the hay and sacks so as to form a rude couch, on which he flung himself down to sleep, for it was getting late. But sleep he could not, for many reasons, of which not the least was thought of his charge. He sat up and looked towards the cot through the damp obscurity. With all its external features the same as usual, he could scarcely believe that it contained the dear friend, he would not use a warmer name, who had come to him so unexpectedly, and, he could not help admitting, so rashly. He had not ventured to ask any particulars, but the position was pretty clear without them. Though social law had negatived forever their opening paradise of the previous June, it was not without stoical pride that he accepted the present trying conjuncture. There was one man on earth in whom she believed absolutely, and he was that man. That this crisis could end in nothing but sorrow was a view for a moment effaced by this triumphant thought of her trust in him, and the purity of the affection with which he responded to that trust rendered him more than proof against any frailty that besieged him in relation to her. The rain, which had never ceased, now drew his attention by beginning to drop through the meagre screen that covered him. He rose to attempt some remedy for his discomfort, but the trembling of his knees and the throbbing of his pulse told him that in his weakness he was unable to fence against the storm, and he lay down to bear it as best he might. He was angry with himself for his feebleness, he who had been so strong. It was imperative that she should know nothing of his present state, and to do that she must not see his face by daylight, for its colour would inevitably betray him. The next morning accordingly, when it was hardly light, he rose and dragged his stiff limbs about the precincts, preparing for her everything she could require for getting breakfast within. On the bench outside the window-sill he placed water, wood, and other necessities, writing with a piece of chalk beside them. "It is best that I should not see you. Put my breakfast on the bench." At 7 o'clock he tapped at her window, as he had promised, retreating at once, that she might not catch sight of him. But from his shelter under the boughs he could see her very well, when, in response to a signal, she opened the window, and the light fell upon her face. The languid largeness of her eyes showed that her sleep had been little more than his own, and the pinkness of their lids, that her waking hours had not been free from tears. She read the writing, seemed, he thought, disappointed, but took up the materials he had provided, evidently thinking him some way off. Giles waited on, assured that a girl who, in spite of her culture, knew what country life was, would find no difficulty in the simple preparation of their food. Within the cot it was all very much as he conjectured, though Grace had slept much longer than he. After the loneliness of the night she would have been glad to see him, but appreciating his feeling when she read the writing, she made no attempt to recall him. She found abundance of provisions laid in, his plan being to replenish his buttery weekly, and this being the day after the victualling van had called from Sherton. When the meal was ready, she put what he required outside, as she had done with the supper, and, notwithstanding her longing to see him, withdrew from the window promptly and left him to himself. It had been a leaden dawn, and the rain now steadily renewed its fall. As she heard no more of Winterborne, she concluded that he had gone away to his daily work, and forgotten that he had promised to accompany her to Sherton. An erroneous conclusion, for he remained all day, by force of his condition, within 50 yards of where she was. The morning wore on, and in her doubt when to start and how to travel, she lingered yet, keeping the door carefully bolted, lest an intruder should discover her. Locked in this place she was comparatively safe, at any rate, and doubted if she would be safe elsewhere. The humid gloom of an ordinary wet day was doubled by the shade and drip of the leafage. Autumn this year was coming in with rains. Gazing in her enforced idleness from the one window of the living-room, she could see various small members of the animal community that lived unmolested there, creatures of hair, fluff, and scale, the toothed kind and the billed kind, underground creatures jointed and ringed, circumambulating the hut, under the impression that, Giles having gone away, nobody was there, and eyeing it inquisitively with a view to winter quarters. Watching these neighbours, who knew neither law nor sin, distracted her a little from her trouble, and she managed to while away some of the portion of the afternoon by putting Giles's home in order and making little improvements which she deemed that he would value when she was gone. Once or twice she fancied that she heard a faint noise amid the trees, resembling a cough, but as it never came any closer, she concluded that it was a squirrel or a bird. At last the daylight lessened, and she made up a larger fire, for the evenings were chilly. As soon as it was too dark, which was comparatively early, to discern the human countenance in this place of shadows, there came to the window, to her great delight, a tapping which she knew from its method to be Giles's. She opened the casement instantly, and put her hand out to him, though she could only just perceive his outline. He clasped her fingers, and she noticed the heat of his palm and its shakiness. He has been walking fast in order to get here quickly, she thought. How could she know that he had just crawled out from the straw of the shelter hard by, and that the heat of his hand was feverishness? "My dear good Giles!" she burst out impulsively. "Anybody would have done it for you," replied Winterborne, with as much matter-of-fact as he could summon. "About my getting to Exbury," she said. "I have been thinking," responded Giles with tender deference, "that you had better stay where you are for the present, if you wish not to be caught. I need not tell you that the place is yours as long as you like, and perhaps in a day or two, finding you absent, he'll go away. At any rate, in 2 or 3 days I could do anything to assist, such as make inquiries, or go a great way towards Sherton Abbas with you, for the cider season will be coming on, and I want to run down the vale to see how the crops are, and I shall go by the Sherton road. But for a day or two I am busy here." He was hoping that by the time mentioned he would be strong enough to engage himself actively on her behalf. "I hope you do not feel over much melancholy at being a prisoner?" She declared that she did not mind it, but she sighed. From long acquaintance they could read each other's heart symptoms like books of large type. "I fear you are sorry you came," said Giles, "and that you think I should have advised you more firmly than I did not to stay." "Oh no, dear, dear friend," answered Grace with a heaving bosom. "Don't think that is what I regret. What I regret is my enforced treatment of you, dislodging you, excluding you from your own house. Why should I not speak out? You know what I feel for you, what I have felt for no other living man, what I shall never feel for a man again. But as I have vowed myself to somebody else than you, and cannot be released, I must behave as I do behave, and keep that vow. I am not bound to him by any divine law, after what he has done, But I have promised, and I will pay." The rest of the evening was passed in his handing her such things as she would require the next day, and casual remarks thereupon, an occupation which diverted her mind to some degree from pathetic views of her attitude towards him, and of life in general. The only infringement, if infringement it could be called, of his predetermined bearing towards her was an involuntary passing of her hand to his lips when she put it through the casement to bid him good night. He knew she was weeping, though he could not see her tears. She again entreated his forgiveness for so selfishly appropriating the cottage. But it would be only for a day or two more, she thought, since go she must. He replied yearningly, I don't like you to go away." "Oh, Giles," said she, I know, but I am a woman, and you are a man. I cannot speak more plainly. Whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are of good report, you know what is in my mind, because you know me so well." "Yes, Grace, yes. I do not at all mean that the question between us has not been settled by the fact of your marriage turning out hopelessly unalterable. I merely meant, well, a feeling, no more. In a week at the outside I should be discovered if I stayed here, and I think that by law he could compel me to return to him." "Yes, perhaps you are right. Go when you wish, dear Grace." His last words that evening were a hopeful remark that all might be well with her yet, that Mr. Fitzpiers would not intrude upon her life if he found that his presence caused her so much pain. Then the window was closed, the shutters folded, and the rustle of his footsteps died away. No sooner had she retired to rest that night than the wind began to rise, and, after a few prefatory blasts, to be accompanied by rain. The wind grew more violent, and as the storm went on it was difficult to believe that no opaque body, but only an invisible colourless thing, was trampling and climbing over the roof, making branches creak, springing out of the trees upon the chimney, popping its head into the flue, and shrieking and blaspheming at every corner of the walls. As in the old story, the assailant was a spectre which could be felt but not seen. She had never before been so struck with the devilry of a gusty night in a wood, because she had never been so entirely alone in spirit as she was now. She seemed almost to be apart from herself, a vacuous duplicate only. The recent self of physical animation and clear intentions was not there. Sometimes a bough from an adjoining tree was swaying so low as to smite the roof, in the manner of a gigantic hand smiting the mouth of an adversary, to be followed by a trickle of rain, as blood from the wound. To all this weather Giles must be more or less exposed. How much she did not know. At last Grace could hardly endure the idea of such hardship in relation to him. Whatever he was suffering, it was she who had caused it. He vacated his house on account of her. She was not worth such self-sacrifice. She should not have accepted it of him. And yet, as her anxiety increased with increasing thought, there returned upon her mind some incidents of her late intercourse with him, which she had heeded but little at the time. The look of his face. What had there been about his face which seemed different from its appearance as of yore? Was it not thinner, less rich in hue, less like that of ripe autumn's brother to whom she had formerly compared him? And his voice, she had distinctly noticed a change in tone. And his gait, surely it had been feebler, stiffer, more like the gait of a weary man. That slight occasional noise she had heard in the day, and attributed to squirrels, it might have been his cough after all. Thus conviction took root in her perturbed mind that Winterborne was ill, or had been so, and that he had carefully concealed his condition from her that she might have no scruples about accepting a hospitality, which, by the nature of the case, expelled her entertainer. "My own true, my dear kind friend," she cried to herself. "Oh, it shall not be! It shall not be!" She hastily wrapped herself up, and obtained a light, with which she entered the adjoining room, the cot possessing only one floor. Setting down the candle on the table there, she went to the door with the key in her hand and placed it in the lock. Before turning it she paused, her fingers still clutching it, and pressing her other hand to her forehead she fell into agitating thought. A tattoo on the window, caused by the tree droppings blowing against it, brought her indecision to a close. She turned the key and opened the door. The darkness was intense, seeming to touch her pupils like a substance. She only now became aware how heavy the rainfall had been and was. The dripping of the eaves splashed like a fountain. She stood listening with parted lips, and holding the door in one hand, till her eyes, growing accustomed to the obscurity, discerned the wild brandishing of their boughs by the adjoining trees. At last she cried loudly, with an effort, "Giles, you may come in." There was no immediate answer to her cry, and overpowered by her own temerity, Grace retreated quickly, shut the door, and stood looking on the floor. But it was not for long. She again lifted the latch, and with far more determination than the first. "Giles! Giles!" she cried with the full strength of her voice, and without any of the shamefacedness that had characterized her first cry. "Come in! Come in! Where are you? I have been wicked, and I have thought too much of myself. Do you hear? I don't want to keep you out any longer. I cannot bear that you should suffer so. Giles!" A reply. It was a reply. Through the darkness and wind a voice reached her, floating upon the weather as though part of it. "Here I am. All right. Don't trouble about me." "Don't you want to come in? Are you not ill? I don't mind what they say or what they think any more." "I am all right," he repeated. "It is not necessary for me to come. Good night, good night." Grace sighed, turned and shut the door slowly. Could she have been mistaken about his health? Perhaps after all she had perceived a change in him because she had not seen him for so long. Time sometimes did his aging work in jerks, as she knew. Chapter 42 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 42. The next morning Grace was at the window early. She felt determined to see him somehow that day, and prepared his breakfast eagerly. 8 o'clock struck, and she remembered that he had not come to arouse her by a knocking as usual, her own anxiety having caused her to stir. The breakfast was set in its place without, but he did not arrive to take it, and she waited on. 9 o'clock arrived, and the breakfast was cold, and still there was no Giles. A thrush, that had been repeating itself a good deal on an opposite bush for some time, came and took a morsel from the plate and bolted it, waited, looked around, and took another. At 10 o'clock she drew in the tray, and sat down to her own solitary meal. He must have been called away on business early, the rain having cleared off. Yet she would have liked to assure herself, by thoroughly exploring the precincts of the hut, that he was nowhere in its vicinity. But as the day was comparatively fine, the dread lest some stray passenger or woodman should encounter her in such a reconnoitre paralyzed her wish. The solitude was further accentuated today by the stopping of the clock for want of winding, and the fall into the chimney-corner of flakes of soot loosened by the rains. At noon she heard a slight rustling outside the window, and found that it was caused by an eft which had crept out of the leaves to bask in the last sun-rays that would be worth having till the following May. She continually peeped out through the lattice, but could see little. In front lay the brown leaves of last year, and upon them some yellowish-green ones of this season that had been prematurely blown down by the gale. Above stretched an old beech with vast armpits and great pocket-holes in its sides, where branches had been amputated in past times. A black slug was trying to climb it. Dead boughs were scattered about like ichthyosauri in a museum, and beyond them were perishing woodbine stems, resembling old ropes. From the other window all she could see were more trees, jacketed with lichen and stockinged with moss. At their roots were stemless yellow fungi like lemons and apricots, and tall fungi with more stem than stool. Next were more trees close together, wrestling for existence, their branches disfigured with wounds resulting from their mutual rubbings and blows. It was the struggle between these neighbours that she had heard in the night. Beneath them were the rotting stumps of those of the group that had been vanquished long ago, rising from their mossy settings like decayed teeth from green gums. Farther on were other tufts of moss, in islands divided by the shed leaves, variety upon variety, dark green and pale green, moss-like little fir trees, like plush, like malachite stars, like nothing on earth except moss. The strain upon Grace's mind in various ways was so great on this the most desolate day she had passed there, that she felt it would be well nigh impossible to spend another in such circumstances. The evening came at last. The sun, when its chin was on the earth, found an opening through which to pierce the shade, and stretched irradiated gauzes across the damp atmosphere, making the wet trunks shine, and throwing splotches of such ruddiness on the leaves beneath the beech that they were turned to gory hues. When night at last arrived, and with it its time for his return, she was nearly broken down with suspense. The simple evening meal, partly tea, partly supper, which Grace had prepared, stood waiting upon the hearth, and yet Giles did not come. It was now nearly 24 hours since she had seen him. As the room grew darker, and only the firelight broke against the gloom of the walls, she was convinced that it would be beyond her staying power to pass the night without hearing from him or from somebody. Yet 8 o'clock drew on, and his form at the window did not appear. The meal remained untasted. Suddenly rising from before the hearth of smouldering embers, where she had been crouching with her hands clasped over her knees, she crossed the room, unlocked the door, and listened. Every breath of wind had ceased with the decline of day, but the rain had resumed the steady dripping of the night before. Grace might have stood there 5 minutes, when she fancied she heard that old sound, a cough at no great distance, and it was presently repeated. If it were Winterborne's he must be very near her. Why then had he not visited her? A horrid misgiving that he could not visit her took possession of Grace, and she looked up anxiously for the lantern, which was hanging above her head. To light it and go in the direction of the sound would be the obvious way to solve the dread problem, but the conditions made her hesitate, and in a moment a cold sweat pervaded her at further sounds from the same quarter. They were low mutterings, at first like persons in conversation, but gradually resolving themselves into varieties of one voice. It was an endless monologue, like that we sometimes hear from inanimate nature in deep secret places, where water flows, or where ivy leaves flap against stones. But by degrees she was convinced that the voice was Winterborne's. Yet who could be his listener, so mute and patient? For though he argued so rapidly and persistently, nobody replied. A dreadful enlightenment spread through the mind of Grace. "Oh!" she cried in her anguish, as she hastily prepared herself to go out. "How selfishly correct I am always! Too correct! Cruel propriety is killing the dearest heart that ever woman clasped to her own." While speaking thus to herself she had lit the lantern, and hastening out without further thought, took the direction whence the mutterings had proceeded. The course was marked by a little path, which ended at a distance of about 40 yards in a small erection of hurdles, not much larger than a shock of corn, such as were frequent in the woods and copses when the cutting season was going on. It was too slight even to be called a hovel, and was not high enough to stand upright in, appearing, in short, to be erected for the temporary shelter of fuel. The side towards Grace was open, and turning the light upon the interior, she beheld what her prescient fear had pictured in snatches all the way thither. Upon the straw within, Winterborne lay in his clothes, just as she had seen him during the whole of her stay there, except that his hat was off and his hair was matted and wild. Both his clothes and the straw were saturated with rain. His arms were flung over his head, his face was flushed to an unnatural crimson. His eyes had a burning brightness, and though they met her own, she perceived that he did not recognize her. "Oh, my Giles!" she cried. "What have I done to you?" But she stopped no longer even to reproach herself. She saw that the first thing to be thought of was to get him indoors. How Grace performed that labour she could never have exactly explained. But by dint of clasping her arms around him, rearing him into a sitting posture, and straining her strength to the uttermost, she put him on one of the hurdles that was loose alongside, and taking the end of it in both of her hands, dragged him along the path to the entrance of the hut, and, after a pause for breath, in at the doorway. It was somewhat singular that Giles, in his semi-conscious state, acquiesced unresistingly in all that she did. But he never for a moment recognized her, continuing his rapid conversation to himself, and seeming to look upon her as some angel or other supernatural creature of the visionary world in which he was mentally living. The undertaking occupied her more than 10 minutes, but by that time, to her great thankfulness, he was in the inner room, lying on the bed, his damp outer clothing removed. Then the unhappy Grace regarded him by the light of the candle. There was something in his look which agonized her, in the rush of his thoughts, accelerating their speed from minute to minute. He seemed to be passing through the universe of ideas like a comet, erratic, inapprehensible, untraceable. Grace's distraction was almost as great as his. In a few moments she firmly believed he was dying. Unable to withstand her impulse, she knelt down beside him, kissed his hands and his face and his hair, exclaiming in a low voice, "How could I? How could I?" Her timid morality had, indeed, underrated his chivalry till now, though she knew him so well. The purity of his nature, his freedom from the grosser passions, his scrupulous delicacy, had never been fully understood by Grace till this strange self-sacrifice in lonely juxtaposition to her own person was revealed. The perception of it added something that was little short of reverence to the deep affection for him of a woman who, herself, had more of Artemis than of Aphrodite in her constitution. All that a tender nurse could do, Grace did, and the power to express her solicitude in action, unconscious though the sufferer was, brought her mournful satisfaction. She bathed his hot head, wiped his perspiring hands, moistened his lips, cooled his fiery eyelids, sponged his heated skin, and administered whatever she could find in the house that the imagination could conceive as likely to be in any way alleviating. That she might have been the cause, or partially the cause, of all this, interfused misery with her sorrow. 6 months before this date a scene, almost similar in its mechanical parts, had been enacted at Hintock House. It was between a pair of persons most intimately connected in their lives with these. Outwardly like as it had been, it was yet infinite in spiritual difference, though a woman's devotion had been common to both. Grace rose from her attitude of affection, and, bracing her energies, saw that something practical must immediately be done. Much as she would have liked, in the emotion of the moment, to keep him entirely to herself, medical assistance was necessary while there remained a possibility of preserving him alive. Such assistance was fatal to her own concealment. But even had the chance of benefiting him been less than it was, she would have run the hazard for his sake. The question was, where should she get a medical man, competent and near? There was one such man, and only one, within accessible distance, a man who, if it were possible to save Winterborne's life, had the brain most likely to do it. If human pressure could bring him, that man ought to be brought to the sick Giles's side. The attempt should be made. Yet she dreaded to leave her patient, and the minutes raced past, and yet she postponed her departure. At last, when it was after 11 o'clock, Winterborne fell into a fitful sleep, and it seemed to afford her an opportunity. She hastily made him as comfortable as she could, put on her things, cut a new candle from the bunch hanging in the cupboard, and having set it up, placed it so that the light did not fall upon his eyes, she closed the door and started. The spirit of Winterborne seemed to keep her company and banish all sense of darkness from her mind. The rains had imparted a phosphorescence to the pieces of touchwood and rotting leaves that lay about her path, which, as scattered by her feet, spread abroad like spilt milk. She would not run the hazard of losing her way by plunging into any short, unfrequented track through the denser parts of the woodland, but followed a more open course, which eventually brought her to the highway. Once here, she ran along with great speed, animated by a devoted purpose which had much about it that was stoical, and it was with scarcely any faltering of spirit that, after an hour's progress, she passed over Rubdown Hill and onward towards that same Hintock, and that same house out of which she had fled a few days before in irresistible alarm. But that had happened which, above all other things, of chance and change, could make her deliberately frustrate her plan of flight and sink all regard of personal consequences. One speciality of Fitzpiers's was respected by Grace as much as ever, his professional skill. In this she was right. Had his persistence equalled his insight, instead of being the spasmodic and fitful thing it was, fame and fortune need never have remained a wish with him. His freedom from conventional errors and crusted prejudices had indeed been such as to retard rather than accelerate his advance in Hintock and its neighbourhood, where people could not believe that nature herself effected cures, and that the doctor's business was only to smooth the way. It was past midnight when Grace arrived opposite her father's house, now again temporarily occupied by her husband, unless he had already gone away. Ever since her emergence from the denser plantations about Winterborne's residence, a pervasive lightness had hung upon the damp autumn sky, in spite of the vault of cloud, signifying that a moon of some age was shining above its arch. The two white gates were distinct, and the white balls on the pillars, and the puddles and damp ruts left by the recent rain, had a cold, corpse-eyed luminousness. She entered by the lower gate, and crossed the quadrangle to the wing, wherein the apartments that had been hers since her marriage were situate, till she stood under a window which, if her husband were in the house, gave light to his bedchamber. She faltered, and paused with her hand on her heart, in spite of herself. Could she call to her presence the very cause of all her foregoing troubles? Alas, old Jones was 7 miles off. Giles was possibly dying. What else could she do? It was in a perspiration, wrought even more by consciousness than by exercise, that she picked up some gravel, threw it at the panes, and waited to see the result. The night bell which had been fixed when Fitzpiers first took up his residence there still remained, but as it had fallen into disuse with the collapse of his practice and his elopement, she did not venture to pull it now. Whoever slept in the room had heard her signal, slight as it was. In half a minute the window was opened, and a voice said, "Yes?" inquiringly. Grace recognized her husband in the speaker at once. Her effort was now to disguise her own accents. "Doctor," she said, in as unusual a tone as she could command, "a man is dangerously ill in One Chimney Hut, out towards Delborough, and you must go to him at once in all mercy." "I will, readily." The alacrity, surprise, and pleasure expressed in his reply amazed her for a moment, but in truth they denoted the sudden relief of a man who, having got back in a mood of contrition, from erratic abandonment to fearful joys, found the soothing routine of professional practice unexpectedly opening anew to him. The highest desire of his soul just now was for a respectable life of painstaking. If this, his first summons since his return, had been to attend upon a cat or dog, he would scarcely have refused it in the circumstances. "Do you know the way?" she asked. "Yes," said he. "One Chimney Hut," she repeated, "and immediately?" "Yes, yes," said Fitzpiers. She remained no longer. She passed out of the white gate without slamming it, and hastened on her way back. Her husband, then, had re-entered her father's house. How he had been able to effect a reconciliation with the old man, what were the terms of the treaty between them, she could not so much as conjecture. Some sort of truce must have been entered into, that was all she could say. But close as the question lay to her own life, there was a more urgent one which banished it, and she traced her steps quickly along the meandering trackways. Meanwhile, Fitzpiers was preparing to leave the house. The state of his mind, over and above his professional zeal, was peculiar. At Grace's first remark he had not recognized or suspected her presence, but as she went on he was awakened to the great resemblance of the speaker's voice to his wife's. He had taken in such good faith the statement of the household on his arrival that she had gone on a visit for a time because she could not at once bring her mind to be reconciled to him, that he could not quite actually believe his comer to be she. It was one of the features of Fitzpiers's repentant humour at this date that, on receiving the explanation of her absence, he had made no attempt to outrage her feelings by following her, though nobody had informed him how very shortly her departure had preceded his entry, and of all that might have been inferred from her precipitancy. Melbury, after much alarm and consideration, had decided not to follow her either. He sympathized with her flight, much as he deplored it. Moreover, the tragic colour of the antecedent events that he had been a great means of creating checked his instinct to interfere. He prayed and trusted that she had got into no danger on her way, as he supposed, to Sherton, and thence to Exbury, if that were the place she had gone to, forbearing all inquiry, since the strangeness of her departure would have made it natural. A few months before this time, a performance by Grace of 1/10 the magnitude of this would have aroused him to unwonted investigation. It was in the same spirit that he had tacitly assented to Fitzpiers's domiciliation there. The two men had not met face to face, but Mrs. Melbury had proposed herself as an intermediary, who made the surgeon's re-entrance comparatively easy to him. Everything was provisional, and nobody asked questions. Fitzpiers had come in the performance of a plan of penitence, which had originated in circumstances hereafter to be explained. His self-humiliation to the very base string was deliberate, and as soon as a call reached him from the bedside of a dying man, his desire was to set to work and do as much good as he could, with the least possible fuss or show. He therefore refrained from calling up a stable. Chapter 43 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 43. She re-entered the hut, flung off her bonnet and cloak, and approached the sufferer. He had begun anew those terrible mutterings, and his hands were cold. As soon as she saw him there returned to her that agony of mind which the stimulus of her journey had thrown off for a time. Could he really be dying? She bathed him, kissed him, forgot all things but the fact that lying there before her was he who had loved her more than the mere lover would have loved, had martyred himself for her comfort, cared more for her self-respect than she had thought of caring. This mood continued till she heard quick, smart footsteps without. She knew whose footsteps they were. Grace sat on the inside of the bed, against the wall, holding Giles's hand, so that when her husband entered, the patient lay between herself and him. He stood transfixed at first, noticing Grace only. Slowly he dropped his glance and discerned who the prostrate man was. Strangely enough, though Grace's distaste for her husband's company had amounted almost to dread, and culminated in actual flight, at this moment her last and least feeling was personal. Sensitive femininity was eclipsed by self-effacing purpose, and that it was a husband who stood there was forgotten. The first look that possessed her face was relief. Satisfaction at the presence of the physician obliterated thoughts of the man, which only returned in the form of a subconscious that did not interfere with her words. "Is he dying? Is there any hope?" she cried. "Grace," said Fitzpiers, in an indescribable whisper, more than invocating, if not quite deprecatory. He was arrested by the spectacle, not so much in its intrinsic character, though that was striking enough to a man who called himself the husband of the sufferer's friend and nurse, but in its character as the counterpart of one that had its hour many months before, in which he had figured as the patient, and the woman had been Felice Charmond. "Is he in great danger? Can you save him?" she cried again. Fitzpiers aroused himself, came a little nearer, and examined Winterborne as he stood. His inspection was concluded in a mere glance. Before he spoke he looked at her contemplatively, as to the effect of his coming words. "He is dying," he said with dry precision. "What?" said she. "Nothing can be done, by me or any other man. It will soon be all over. The extremities are dead already." His eyes still remained fixed on her, the conclusion to which he had come seemed to end his interest, professional and otherwise, in Winterborne for ever. "But it cannot be. He was well 3 days ago." "Not well, I expect. This seemed like a secondary attack, which has followed some previous illness, possibly typhoid. It may have been months ago, or recently." "Ah, he was not well, you are right. He was ill. He was ill when I came." There was nothing more to do or say. She crouched down at the side of the bed, and Fitzpiers took a seat. Thus they remained in silence, and long as it lasted she never turned her eyes, or apparently her thoughts, at all to her husband. He occasionally murmured with automatic authority some slight directions for alleviating the pain of the dying man, which she mechanically obeyed, bending over him during the intervals in silent tears. Winterborne never recovered consciousness of what was passing, and that he was going became soon perceptible also to her. In less than an hour the delirium passed. Then there was an interval of somnolent painlessness and soft breathing, at the end of which Winterborne passed quietly away. Then Fitzpiers broke the silence. "Have you lived here long?" said he. Grace was wild with sorrow, with all that had befallen her, with the cruelties that had attacked her, with life, with heaven. She answered at random, "Yes. By what right do you ask?" "Don't think I claim any right," said Fitzpiers sadly. "It is for you to do and say what you choose. I admit, quite as much as you feel, that I am a vagabond, a brute, not worthy to possess the smallest fragment of you. But here I am, and I have happened to take sufficient interest in you to make that inquiry." "He is everything to me," said Grace, hardly heeding her husband, and laying her hand reverently on the dead man's eyelids, where she kept it a long time, pressing down their lashes with gentle touches, as if she were stroking a little bird. He watched her a while, and then glanced round the chamber, where his eyes fell upon a few dressing necessities that she had brought. "Grace, if I may call you so," he said, "I have been already humiliated almost to the depths. I have come back, since you refused to join me elsewhere. I have entered your father's house, and borne all that cost me without flinching, because I have felt that I deserved humiliation. But is there yet greater humiliation in store for me? You say you have been living here, that he is everything to you. Am I to draw from that the obvious, the extremest inference? Triumph at any price is sweet to men and women, especially the latter. It was her first and last opportunity for repaying him for the cruel contumely which she had borne at his hands so docilely. "Yes," she answered, and there was that in her subtly compounded nature which made her feel a thrill of pride as she did so. Yet the moment after she had so mightily belied her character she half repented. Her husband had turned as white as the wall behind him. It seemed as if all that remained to him of life and spirit had been abstracted at a stroke. Yet he did not move, and in his efforts at self-control closed his mouth together as a vice. His determination was fairly successful, though she saw how very much greater than she had expected her triumph had been. Presently he looked across at Winterborne. "Would it startle you to hear," he said, as if he hardly had breath to utter the words, "that she who was to me what he was to you is dead also?" Dead? She dead? Exclaimed Grace. Yes, Felice Charmond is where this young man is. Never, said Grace vehemently. He went on without heeding the insinuation. And I came back to try to make it up with you, but... Fitzpiers rose and moved across the room to go away, looking downward with the droop of a man whose hope was turned to apathy, if not despair. In going round the door his eye fell upon her once more. She was still bending over the body of Winterborne, her face close to the young man's. "Have you been kissing him during his illness?" asked her husband. "Yes." "Since his fevered state set in?" "Yes." "On his lips?" "Yes." "Then you will do well to take a few drops of this in water as soon as possible." He drew a small phial from his pocket and returned to offer it to her. Grace shook her head. "If you don't do as I tell you, you may soon be like him." "I don't care. I wish to die." "I'll put it here," said Fitzpiers, placing the bottle on a ledge beside him. "The sin of not having warned you will not be on my head at any rate, among my other sins. I am now going, and I will send somebody to you. Your father does not know that you are here, so I suppose I shall be bound to tell him." "Certainly." Fitzpiers left the cot, and the stroke of his feet was soon immersed in the silence that pervaded the spot. Grace remained kneeling and weeping, she hardly knew how long, and then she sat up, covered poor Giles's features, and went towards the door where her husband had stood. No sign of any other comer greeted her ear, the only perceptible sounds being the tiny cracklings of the dead leaves, which, like a feather bed, had not yet done rising to their normal level where indented by the pressure of her husband's receding footsteps. It reminded her that she had been struck with a change in his aspect. The extremely intellectual look that had always been in his face was wrought to a finer phase by thinness, and the careworn dignity had been superadded. She returned to Winterborne's side, and during her meditations another tread drew near the door, entered the outer room, and halted at the entrance of the chamber where Grace was. "What, Marty?" said Grace. "Yes, I have heard," said Marty, whose demeanour had lost all its girlishness under the stroke that seemed almost literally to have bruised her. "He died for me," murmured Grace heavily. Marty did not fully comprehend, and she answered, "He belongs to neither of us now, and your beauty is no more powerful with him than my plainness. I have come to help you, ma'am. He never cared for me, and he cared much for you, but he cares for us both alike now." "Oh, don't, Marty." Marty said no more, but knelt over Winterborne from the other side. "Did you meet my Mr. Fitzpiers?" "No." "Then what brought you here?" "I come this way sometimes. I have got to go to the farther side of the wood this time of the year, and I am obliged to get there before 4 o'clock in the morning, to begin heating the oven for the early baking. I have passed by here often at this time." Grace looked at her quickly. "Then did you know I was here?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did you tell anybody?" "No. I knew you lived in the hut, that he'd give it up to you, and lodged out himself." "Did you know where he lodged?" "No, that I couldn't find out. Was it at Delborough?" "No, it was not there, Marty. Would it had been! It would have saved. To check her tears she turned, and seeing a book on the window-bench took it up. "Look, Marty, this is a psalter. He was not an outwardly religious man, but he was pure and perfect in his heart. Shall we read a psalm over him?" "Oh, yes, we will, with all my heart." Grace opened the thin brown book which poor Giles had kept at hand, mainly for the convenience of whetting his penknife upon its leather covers. She began to read in that rich, devotional voice peculiar to women only on such occasions. When it was over, Marty said, "I should like to pray for his soul." "So should I," said her companion, "but we must not." "Why, nobody would know." Grace could not resist the argument, influenced as she was by the sense of making amends for having neglected them in the body, and their tender voices united and filled the narrow room with supplicatory murmurs that a Calvinist might have envied. They had hardly ended when new and more numerous footfalls were audible, also persons in conversation, one of whom Grace recognized as her father. She rose and went to the outer apartment, in which there was only such light as beamed from the inner one. Melbury and Mrs. Melbury were standing there. "I don't reproach you, Grace," said her father, with an estranged manner, and in a voice not at all like his old voice. "What has come upon you and us is beyond reproach, beyond weeping, beyond wailing. Perhaps I drove you to it, but I am hurt, I am scourged, I am astonished. In the face of this, there is nothing to be said." Without replying, Grace turned and glided back to the inner chamber. "Marty," she said quickly, "I cannot look my father in the face until he knows the true circumstances of my life here. Go and tell him what you have told me, what you saw, that he gave up his house to me." She sat down, her face buried in her hands, and Marty went, and after a short absence returned. Then Grace rose, and going out asked her father if he had met her husband. "Yes," said Melbury. "And you know all that has happened?" "I do. Forgive me, Grace, for suspecting ye of worse than rashness. I ought to know you better. Are you coming with me to what was once your home?" "No, I am staying with him. Take no account of me any more." The unwonted, perplexing, agitating relations in which he had stood to Winterborne quite lately, brought about by Melbury's own contrivance, could not fail to soften the natural anger of a parent at her more recent doings. "My daughter, things are bad," he rejoined. "But why do you persevere to make 'em worse? What good can you do to Giles by staying here with him? Mind, I ask no questions. I don't inquire why you decided to come here, or anything as to what your course would have been if he had not died, though I know there's no deliberate harm in ye. As for me, I have lost all claim upon ye, and I make no complaint. But I do say that by coming back with me now you will show no less kindness to him, and escape any sound of shame." "But I don't wish to escape it." "If you don't on your own account, can you not wish it on mine and hers? Nobody except our household knows that you left home. Then why should you, by a piece of perverseness, bring down my grey hairs with sorrow to the grave?" "If it were not for my husband," she began, moved by his words. "But how can I meet him there? How can any woman who is not a mere man's creature join him after what has taken place?" "He would go away again rather than keep you out of the house." "How do you know that, father?" "We met him on our way here, and he told us so," said Mrs. Melbury. "He had said something like it before. He seems very much upset altogether." "He declared to her that when he came to our house that he would wait for time and devotion to bring about his forgiveness," said her husband. "That was it, wasn't it, Lucy?" "Yes. He said that he would not intrude upon you, Grace, till you gave him absolute permission," Mrs. Melbury added. The antecedent considerateness of Fitzpiers was as welcome to Grace as it was unexpected, and though she did not desire his presence, she was sorry that by her retaliatory fiction she had given him a different reason for avoiding her. She made no further objections to accompanying her parents, taking them into the inner room to give Winterborne a last look, and gathering up the 2 or 3 things that belonged to her. While she was doing this, the 2 women came who had been called by Melbury, and at their heels poor Creedle. "Forgive me, but I can't rule my morning nohow as a man should, Mr. Melbury," he said. "I han't seen him since Thursday night, and I've wondered for days where he's been keeping. There was I expecting him to come home and tell me to wash out the cider barrels against the making, and here he was. Well, I knowed him from Table High. I knowed his father. Used to bide out upon 2 sticks in the sun afore he died. And now we've seen the end of the family, which we can ill afford to lose with such a scanty lot of good folk in Hintock as we got. And now Robert Creedle will be nailed up on parish boards, I believe, and nobody will glutch down a sigh for he." They started for home, Marty and Creedle remaining behind. For a time Grace and her father walked side by side without speaking. It was just in the blue of the dawn, and the chilling tone of the sky was reflected in her cold, wet face. The whole wood seemed to be a house of death, pervaded by loss to its uttermost length and breadth. Winterborne was gone, and the copses seemed to show the want of him. The young trees, so many of which he had planted, and of which he had spoken so truly, when he had said that he should fall before they fell, were at that very moment sending out their roots in the direction that he had given them with his subtle hand. "One thing made it tolerable to us that your husband should come back to the house," said Melbury at last. "The death of Mrs. Charmond." "Ah, yes," said Grace, arousing slightly to the recollection. "He told me so." "Did he tell you how she died?" "It was no such death as Giles's. She was shot by a disappointed lover. It occurred in Germany. The unfortunate man shot himself afterwards. He was that South Carolina gentleman of very passionate nature who used to haunt this place to force her to an interview, and followed her about everywhere. So ends the brilliant Felice Charmond, once a good friend to me, but no friend to you." "I can forgive her," said Grace absently. "Did Edgar tell you of this?" "No, but he put a London newspaper giving an account of it on the hall table, folded in such a way that we should see it. It'll be in the Sherton paper this week, no doubt." To make the event more solemn still to him, he had just before had sharp words with her, and left her. He told Lucy this, as nothing about him appears in the newspaper. "And the cause of the quarrel was, of all people, she we've left behind us." "Do you mean Marty?" Grace spoke the words but perfunctorily, for pertinent and pointed as Melbury's story was, she had no heart for it now. "Yes, Marty South." Melbury persisted in his narrative, to divert her from her present grief if possible. "Before he went away she wrote him a letter, which he kept in his pocket a long while before reading. He chanced to pull it out in Mrs. Charmond's presence, and read it out loud. It contained something which teased her very much, and that led to the rupture. She was following him to make it up when she met with her terrible death." Melbury did not know enough to give the gist of the incident, which was that Marty South's letter had been concerning a certain personal adornment common to herself and Mrs. Charmond. Her bullet reached its billet at last. The scene between Fitzpiers and Felice had been sharp, as only a scene can be which arises out of the mortification of one woman by another in the presence of a lover. True, Marty had not effected it by word of mouth. The charge about the locks of hair was made simply by Fitzpiers, reading her letter to him aloud to Felice, in the playfully ironical tones of one who had become a little weary of his situation, and was finding his friend, in the phrase of George Herbert, a flat delight. He had stroked those false tresses with his hand many a time without knowing them to be transplanted, and it was impossible, when the discovery was so abruptly made, to avoid being finely satirical, despite her generous disposition. That was how it had begun, and tragedy had been its end. On his abrupt departure she had followed him to the station, but the train was gone, and in travelling to Baden in search of him she had met his rival, whose reproaches led to an altercation, and the death of both. Of that precipitate scene of passion and crime Fitzpiers had known nothing till he saw an account of it in the papers, where, fortunately for himself, no mention was made of his prior acquaintance with the unhappy lady. Nor was there any allusion to him in the subsequent inquiry, the double death being attributed to some gambling losses, though in point of fact neither one of them had visited the tables. Melbury and his daughter drew near the house. Having seen but one living thing on their way, a squirrel, which did not run up its tree, but, dropping the sweet chestnut which it carried, cried chut, 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 and stamped with its hind legs on the ground. When the roofs and chimneys of the homestead began to emerge from the screen of boughs, Grace started, and checked herself in her abstracted advance. "You clearly understand," she said to her stepmother, some of her old misgiving returning, "that I am coming back only on condition of his leaving as he promised. Will you let him know this, that there may be no mistake?"
Mrs. Melbury, who had some long private talks with Fitzpiers, assured Grace that she need have no doubts on that point, and that he would probably be gone by the evening. Grace then entered with him into Melbury's wing of the house, and sat down listlessly in the parlour, while her stepmother went to Fitzpiers. The prompt obedience to their wishes which the surgeon showed did honour to him, if anything could. Before Mrs. Melbury had returned to the room, Grace, who was sitting on the parlour window-bench, saw her husband go from the door under the increasing light of morning, with a bag in his hand. While passing through the gate he turned his head. The firelight of the room she sat in threw her figure into dark relief against the window as she looked through the panes, and he must have seen her distinctly. In a moment he went on, the gate fell to, and he disappeared.
Chapter 44 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders, by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 44. Fitzpiers had hardly been gone an hour when Grace began to sicken. The next day she kept her room. Old Jones was called in. He murmured some statements in which the words feverish symptoms occurred. Grace heard them, and guessed the means by which she had brought this visitation upon herself. One day, while she still lay there with her head throbbing, wondering if she really were going to join him who had gone before her, Grandma Oliver came to her bedside. "I don't know where this is meant for you to take, ma'am," she said, "but I found it on the table. It was left by Marty, I think, when she came this morning." Grace turned her hot eyes upon what Grammer held up. It was the phial left at the hut by her husband when he had begged her to take some drops of its contents, if she wished to preserve herself from falling victim to the malady which had pulled down Winterborne. She examined it as well as she could. The liquid was of an opaline hue, and bore a label with an inscription in Italian. He had probably got it in his wanderings abroad. She knew but little Italian, but could understand that the cordial was a febrifuge of some sort. Her father, her mother, and all the household were anxious for her recovery, and she resolved to obey her husband's directions. Whatever the risk, if any, she was prepared to run it. A glass of water was brought, and the drops dropped in. The effect, though not miraculous, was remarkable. In less than an hour she felt calmer, cooler, better able to reflect, less inclined to fret and chafe and wear herself away. She took a few drops more. From that time the fever retreated, and went out like a damped conflagration. "How clever he is," she said regretfully. "Why could he not have had more principle, so as to turn his great talents to good account? Perhaps he has saved my useless life, but he doesn't know it, and doesn't care whether he has saved it or not, and on that account will never be told by me. Probably he only gave it to me in the arrogance of his skill, to show the greatness of his resources beside mine, as Elijah drew down fire from heaven." As soon as she had quite recovered from this foiled attack upon her life, Grace went to Marty South's cottage. The current of her being had again set towards the loss of Giles Winterborne. "Marty," she said, "we both loved him. Will we go to his grave together?" Great Hintock Church stood at the upper part of the village, and could be reached without passing through the street. In the dusk of the late September day they went thither by secret ways, walking mostly in silence side by side, each busied with her own thoughts. Grace had a trouble exceeding Marty's, that haunting sense of having put out the light of his life by her own hasty doings. She had tried to persuade herself that he might have died of his illness, even if she had not taken possession of his house. Sometimes she succeeded in her attempt, sometimes she did not. They stood by the grave together, and though the sun had gone down they could see over the woodland for miles, down to the vale in which he had been accustomed to descend every year, with his portable mill and press, to make cider about this time. Perhaps Grace's first grief,
The discovery that if he had lived he could never have claimed her had some power in softening this, the second. On Marty's part there was the same consideration. Never would she have been his, as no anticipation of gratified affection had been in existence while he was with them. There was none to be disappointed now that he was gone. Grace was abased when by degrees she found that she never understood Giles as Marty had done. Marty South alone, of all the women in Hintock and the world, had approximated to Winterborne's level of intelligent intercourse with nature. In that respect she had formed the complement to him in the other sex, had lived as his counterpart, had subjoined her thought to his as a corollary. The casual glimpses which the ordinary population bestowed upon that wondrous world of sap and leaves called the Hintock woods had been with these two, Giles and Marty, a clear gaze. They had been possessed of its finer mysteries as of commonplace knowledge. They had been able to read its hieroglyphics as ordinary writing. To them the sights and sounds of night, winter, wind, storm, amid those dense boughs, which had to Grace a touch of the uncanny and even the supernatural, were simple occurrences whose origin, continuance, and laws they foreknew. They had planted together, and together they had felled. Together they had, with the run of the years, mentally collected those remoter signs and symbols which, seen in few, were of runic obscurity, but all together made an alphabet. From the slight lashings of the twigs upon their faces, when brushing through them in the dark, they could pronounce upon the species of the tree whence they stretched. From the quality of the wind's murmur through a bough, they could in like manner name its sort afar off. They knew by a glance at a trunk if its heart were sound, or tainted with incipient decay, and by the state of its upper twigs the stratum that had been reached by its roots. The artifices of the season were seen by them from the conjurer's own point of view, and not from that of the spectators. "He ought to have married you, Marty, and nobody else in the world," said Grace with conviction, after thinking somewhat in the above strain. Marty shook her head. "In all our out-of-door days and years together, ma'am," she replied, "the one thing that he never spoke of to me was love, nor I to him." "And yet you and he could speak in a tongue that nobody else knew, not even my father, though he came nearest knowing, the tongues of the trees and fruits and flowers themselves." She could indulge in mournful fancies like this to Marty, but the hard core to her grief, which Marty's had not, remained. Had she been sure that Giles's death resulted entirely from his exposure, it would have driven her well nigh to insanity, but there was always that bare possibility that his exposure had only precipitated what was inevitable. She longed to believe that it had not done even this. There was only one man whose opinion on the circumstances she would be at all disposed to trust. Her husband was that man. Yet to ask him it would be necessary to detail the true conditions in which she and Winterborne had lived during these 3 or 4 critical days that followed her flight, and in withdrawing her original defiant announcement on that point there seemed a weakness which she did not care to show. She doubted that Fitzpiers would believe her if she made a clean confession of the actual situation. But to volunteer the correction would seem like signalling for a truce, and that, in her present frame of mind, was what she did not feel the need of. It will probably not appear a surprising statement, after what has been already declared of Fitzpiers, that a man whom Grace's fidelity could not keep faithful was stung into passionate throbs of interest concerning her by her avowal of the contrary. He declared to himself that he had never known her dangerously full compass if she were capable of such reprisal, and, melancholy as it may be to admit the fact, his own humiliation and regret engendered a smouldering admiration of her. He passed a month or 2 of great misery in Exbury, the place to which he had retired. Quite as much misery indeed as Grace, could she have known it, would have been inclined to inflict upon any living creature, how much soever he might have wronged her. Then a sudden hope dawned upon him. He wondered if her affirmation were true. He asked himself whether it were not the act of a woman whose natural purity and innocence had blinded her to the contingencies of such an announcement. His wide experience of the sex had taught him that, in many cases, women who ventured on hazardous matters did so because they lacked an imagination sensuous enough to feel their full force. In this light Grace's bold avowal might merely have denoted the desperation of one who was a child to the realities of obliquity. Fitzpiers's mental sufferings and suspense led him at last to take a melancholy journey to the neighbourhood of Little Hintock, and here he hovered for hours around the scene of the purest emotional experiences that he had ever known in his life. He walked about the woods that surrounded Melbury's house, keeping out of sight like a criminal. It was a fine evening, and on his way homeward he passed near Marty South's cottage. As usual, she had lighted her candle without closing her shutters. He saw her within, as he had seen her many times before. She was polishing tools, and though he had not wished to show himself, he could not resist speaking into her through the half-open door. "What are you doing that for, Marty?" "Because I want to clean them. They are not mine." He could see indeed that they were not hers, for one was a spade, large and heavy, and another was a bill-hook, which she could only have used with both hands. The spade, though not a new one, had been so completely burnished that it was as bright as silver. Fitzpiers somehow divined that they were Giles Winterborne's, and he put the question to her. She replied in the affirmative. "I am going to keep him," she said, "but I can't get his apple mill and press. I wish I could. It is going to be sold, they say." "Then I will buy it for you," said Fitzpiers. "That will be making you a return for the kindness you did me." His glance fell upon the girl's rare-coloured hair, which had grown again. "Oh, Marty, those locks of yours, and that letter! But it was a kindness to send it, nevertheless," he added musingly. After this there was a confidence between them, such confidence as there had never been before. Marty was shy, indeed, of speaking about the letter, and her motives in writing it, but she thanked him warmly for his promise of the cider press. She would travel with it in the autumn season, as he had done, she said. She would be quite strong enough, with old Creedle as an assistant. "Ah, there was one nearer to him than you," said Fitzpiers, referring to Winterborne. "One who lived where he lived, and was with him when he died." Then Marty, suspecting that he did not know the true circumstances, from the fact that Mrs. Fitzpiers and himself were living apart, told him of Giles's generosity to Grace in giving up his house to her at the risk, and possibly the sacrifice, of his own life. When the surgeon heard it, he almost envied Giles his chivalrous character. He expressed a wish to Marty that his visit to her should be kept secret, and went home thoughtfully, feeling that in more than one sense his journey to Hintock had not been in vain. He would have given much to win Grace's forgiveness then, but whatever he dared to hope for in that kind from the future, there was nothing to be done yet, while Giles Winterborne's memory was green. To wait was imperative. Chapter 45 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 45. The weeks and months of mourning for Winterborne had been passed by Grace in the soothing monotony of the memorial act to which she and Marty had devoted themselves. Twice a week the pair went in the dusk to Great Hintock, and like the two mourners in Cymbeline, sweetened his sad grave with their flowers and their tears. Sometimes Grace thought that it was a pity neither one of them had been his wife for a little while, and given the world a copy of him who was so valuable in their eyes. Nothing ever had brought home to her with such force as the death how little acquirements and culture weigh beside sterling personal character. While her simple sorrow for his loss took a softer edge with the lapse of the autumn and winter seasons, her self-reproach at having had a possible hand in causing it knew little abatement. Little occurred at Hintock during these months of the fall and decay of the leaf. Discussion of the almost contemporaneous death of Mrs. Charmond abroad had waxed and waned. Fitzpiers had had a marvellous escape from being dragged into the inquiry which followed it, through the accident of their having parted just before, under the influence of Marty South's letter, the tiny instrument of a cause deep in nature. Her body was not brought home. It seemed to accord well with the fitful fever of that impassioned woman's life that she should not have found a native grave. She had enjoyed but a life interest in the estate, which, after her death, passed to a relative of her husband's, one who knew not Felice, and whose purpose seemed to be to blot out every vestige of her. On a certain day in February, the cheerful day of St. Valentine, in fact, a letter reached Mrs. Fitzpiers, which had been mentally promised her for that particular day a long time before. It announced that Fitzpiers was living at some Midland town, where he had obtained a temporary practice as assistant to some local medical man, whose curative principles were all wrong, though he dared not set them right. He had thought fit to communicate with her on that day of tender traditions, to inquire if, in the event of his obtaining a substantial practice that he had in view elsewhere, she could forget the past and bring herself to join him. There the practical part ended, and he went on. My last year of experience has added 10 years to my age, dear Grace, and dearest wife that ever an erring man undervalued. You may be absolutely indifferent to what I say, but let me say it. I have never loved any woman, alive or dead, as I love, respect, and honour you at this present moment. What you told me in pride and haughtiness of your heart I never believed. This, by the way, was not strictly true. But even if I had believed it, it could not have estranged me from you. Is there any use in telling you? No, there is not. That I dream of your ripe lips more frequently than I say my prayers. That the old familiar rustle of your dress often returns upon my mind till it distracts me. If you could condescend, even only to see me again, you would be breathing life into a corpse. My pure, pure Grace, modest as turtle dove, how came I ever to possess you? For the sake of being present in your mind on this lover's day, I think I would almost rather have you hate me a little than not think of me at all. You may call my fancies whimsical, but remember, sweet lost one, that nature is one in love, and where 'tis fine it sends some instance of itself. I will not intrude upon you further now. Make me a little bit happy by sending back one line to say that you will consent, at any rate, to a short interview. I will meet you and leave you as a mere acquaintance, if you will only afford me the slight means of making a few explanations, and of putting my position before you. Believe me, in spite of all you may do or feel, your lover always, once your husband, E. It was, oddly enough, the first occasion, or nearly the first, on which Grace had ever received a love letter from him, his courtship having taken place under conditions which rendered letter-writing unnecessary. Its perusal, therefore, had a certain novelty for her. She thought that, upon the whole, he wrote love-letters very well, but the chief rational interest of the letter to the reflective Grace lay in the chance that such a meeting as he proposed would offer her of setting her doubts at rest, one way or the other, on her actual share in Winterborne's death. The relief of consulting a skilled mind, the one professional man who had seen Giles at the time, would be immense. As for that statement that she had uttered in her disdainful grief, which at the time she had regarded as her triumph, she was quite prepared to admit to him that his belief was the true one. For in wronging herself as she did when she made it, she had done what to her was a far more serious thing. She wronged Winterborne's memory. Without consulting her father, or any one in the house or out of it, Grace replied to the letter. She agreed to meet Fitzpiers on 2 conditions, of which the first was that the place of the meeting should be the top of Rubdown Hill, the second that he would not object to Marty South accompanying her. Whatever part, much or little, there may have been in Fitzpiers's so-called Valentine to his wife, he felt a delight as of the bursting of spring when a brief reply came. It was one of the few pleasures that he had experienced of late years at all resembling those of his early youth. He promptly replied that he accepted the conditions, and named the day and hour at which he would be on the spot she mentioned. A few minutes before 3 on the appointed day found him climbing the well-known hill, which had been the axis of so many critical movements in their lives during his residence at Hintock. The sight of each homely and well-remembered object swelled the regret that seldom left him now. Whatever paths might lie open to his future, the soothing shades of Hintock were forbidden him for ever as a permanent dwelling-place. He longed for the society of Grace, but to lay offerings on her slighted altar was his first aim, and until her propitiation was complete he would constrain her in no way to return to him. The least reparation that he could make, in a case where he would gladly have made much, would be to let her feel absolutely free to choose between living with him and without him. Moreover, as subtlest in emotions, he cultivated as under glass strange and mournful pleasures that he would not willingly let die just at present. To show any forwardness in suggesting a modus vivendi to Grace would be to put an end to these exotics. To be the vassal of her sweet will for a time, he demanded no more, and found solace in the contemplation of the soft misery she caused him. Approaching the hilltop with a mind strung to these notions, Fitzpiers discerned a gay procession of people coming over the crest, and was not long in perceiving it to be a wedding party. Though the wind was keen, the women were in light attire, and the flowered waistcoats of the men had a pleasing vividness of pattern. Each of the gentler ones clung to the arm of her partner so tightly as to have with him one step, rise, swing, gait, almost one centre of gravity. In the buxom bride Fitzpiers recognized no other than Suke Damson, who in her light gown looked a giantess. The small husband beside her he saw to be Tim Tangs. Fitzpiers could not escape, for they had seen him, though of all the beauties in the world whom he did not wish to meet, Suke was the chief. But he put the best face on the matter that he could, and came on, the approaching company evidently discussing him and his separation from Mrs. Fitzpiers. As the couples closed upon him he expressed his congratulations. "We be just walking round the parishes to show ourselves a bit," said Tim. "First we head across to Delborough, and athwart to here, and from here we go to Rubdown and Millshot, and then round by the cross roads home." "Home," says I, "but it won't be that long. We'll be off next month." "Indeed? Where to?" Tim informed him that they were going to New Zealand. Not but that he would have been contented with Hintock, but his wife was ambitious and wanted to leave, so he had given way. "Then good-bye," said Fitzpiers. "I may not see you again." He shook hands with Tim and turned to the bride. "Good-bye, Suke," he said, taking her hand also. "I wish you and your husband prosperity in the country you have chosen." With this he left them and hastened on to his appointment. The wedding party reformed and resumed march likewise, but in restoring his arm to Suke, Tim noticed that her full and blooming countenance had undergone a change. "Hello, my dear, what's the matter?" said Tim. "Nothing to speak of," said she, but to give the lie to her assertion she was seized with lachrymose twitches that soon produced a dribbling face. "Now, what the devil's this about?" exclaimed the bridegroom. "She's a little wee bit overcome, poor dear," said the first bridesmaid, unfolding her handkerchief and wiping Suke's eyes. "I never did like parting from people," said Suke as soon as she could speak. "Why him in particular?" "Well, he's such a clever doctor, 'tis a thousand pities we shan't see him any more. There'll be no such clever doctor as he in New Zealand if I should require one, and the thought of it got the better of my feelings." They walked on, but Tim's face had grown rigid and pale, for he recalled slight circumstances disregarded at the time of their occurrence. The former boisterous laughter of the wedding party at the groomsman's jokes was heard ringing through the woods no more. By this time Fitzpiers had advanced on his way to the top of the hill, where he saw two figures emerging from the bank on the right hand. These were the expected ones, Grace and Marty South, who had evidently come there by a short and secret path through the wood. Grace was muffled up in her winter dress, and he thought that she had never looked so seductive as at this moment, in the noontide bright but heatless sun, and the keen wind, and the purplish grey masses of brushwood around. Fitzpiers continued to regard the nearing picture, till at length their glances met for a moment, when she demurely set off hers at a tangent, and gave him the benefit of her three-quarter face, while with courteous completeness of conduct he lifted his hat in a large arc. Marty dropped behind, and when Fitzpiers held out his hand, Grace touched it with her fingers. "I have agreed to be here mostly because I wanted to ask you something important," said Mrs. Fitzpiers, her intonation modulating in a direction that she had not quite wished it to take. "I am most attentive," said her husband. "Shall we take to the wood for privacy?" Grace demurred, and Fitzpiers gave in, and they kept the public road. At any rate, would she take his arm? This was also gravely negatived, the refusal being audible to Marty. "Why not?" he inquired. "Oh, Mr. Fitzpiers, how can you ask?" "Right, right," he said, his effusiveness shrivelled up. As they walked on she returned to her inquiry. "It is about a matter that may perhaps be unpleasant to you, but I think I need not consider that too carefully." "Not at all," said Fitzpiers heroically. Then she took him back to the time of poor Winterborne's death, and related the precise circumstances amid which his fatal illness had come upon him, particularizing the dampness of the shelter to which he had betaken himself, his concealment from her of the hardship that he was undergoing, all that he had put up with, all that he had done for her in his scrupulous considerateness. The retrospect brought her to tears as she asked him if he thought that the sin of having driven him to his death was upon her. Fitzpiers could hardly help showing his satisfaction at what her narrative indirectly revealed, the actual harmlessness of an escapade with her lover, which had at first, by her own showing, looked so grave, and he did not care to inquire whether that harmlessness had been the result of aim or accident. With regard to her question, he declared that in his judgment no human being could answer it. He thought that upon the whole the balance of probabilities turned in her favour. Winterborne's apparent strength during the last months of his life must have been delusive. It had often occurred that after a first attack of that insidious disease a person's apparent recovery was a physiological mendacity. The relief which came to Grace lay almost as much in sharing her knowledge of the particulars with an intelligent mind as in the assurances Fitzpiers gave her. "Well, then, to put this case before you and obtain your professional opinion was chiefly why I consented to come here to-day," said she, when he had reached the aforesaid conclusion. "For no other reason at all?" he asked ruefully. "It was nearly the whole." They stood and looked over a gate at 20 or 30 starlings feeding in the grass, and he started the talk again by saying in a low voice, "And yet I love you more than I ever loved you in my life." Grace did not move her eyes from the birds, and folded her delicate lips as if to keep them in subjection. "It is a different kind of love altogether," said he, "less passionate, more profound. It has nothing to do with the material conditions of the object at all, much to do with the character and goodness as revealed by closer observation. Love talks with better knowledge, and knowledge with dearer love." "That's out of Measure for Measure," she said slyly. "Oh yes, I meant it as a citation," blandly replied Fitzpiers. "Well then, why not give me a very little bit of your heart again?" The crash of a felled tree in the remote depths of the wood recalled the past at that moment, and all the homely faithfulness of Winterborne. "Don't ask it. My heart is in the grave with Giles," she replied staunchly. "Mine is with you, in no less steep a grave, I fear, according to that." "I am very sorry, but it cannot be helped." "How can you be sorry for me when you wilfully keep open the grave?" "Oh no, that is not so," returned Grace quickly, and moved to go away from him. "But, dearest Grace," said he, "you have condescended to come, and I thought from it that perhaps when I had passed through a long state of probation you would be generous. But if there can be no hope of our getting completely reconciled, treat me gently, wretch though I am." "I did not say you were a wretch, nor have I ever said so." "But you have such a contemptuous way of looking at me that I fear you think so." Grace's heart struggled between the wish not to be harsh and the fear that she might mislead him. "I cannot look contemptuous unless I feel contempt," she said evasively, "and all I feel is lovelessness." "I have been very bad, I know," he returned. "But unless you can really love me again, Grace, I would rather go away from you forever. I don't want you to receive me again for duty's sake, or anything of that sort. If I had not cared more for your affection and forgiveness than my own personal comfort, I should not have come back here. I could have obtained a practice at a distance, and have lived my own life without coldness or reproach. But I have chosen to return to the one spot on earth where my name is tarnished, to enter the house of a man from whom I have had worse treatment than from any other man alive, all for you." This was undeniably true, and it had its weight with Grace, who began to look as if she thought she had been shockingly severe. "Before you go," he continued, "I want to know your pleasure about me. What do you wish me to do or not to do?" "You are independent of me, and it seems a mockery to ask that. Far be it from me to advise. But I will think it over. I rather need advice myself than stand in a position to give it." "You don't need advice, wisest, dearest woman that ever lived. If you did—" "Would you give it to me?" "Would you act upon what I gave?" "That is not a fair inquiry," she said, smiling despite her gravity. "I don't mind hearing it. What you do really think the most correct and proper course for me?" "It is so easy for me to say, yet I dare not, for it would be provoking you to remonstrances." Knowing, of course, what the advice would be, she did not press him further, and was about to beckon Marty forward and leave him, when he interrupted her with, "Oh, one moment, dear Grace. Will you meet me again?" She eventually agreed to meet him that day fortnight. Fitzpiers expostulated at the interval, but the half-alarmed earnestness with which she entreated him not to come sooner made him say hastily that he submitted to her will, that he would regard her as a friend only, anxious for his reform and well-being, till such time as she might allow him to exceed that privilege. All this was to assure her. It was only too clear that he had not won her confidence yet. It amazed Fitzpiers, and overthrew all his deductions from previous experience, to find that this girl, though she had been married to him, could yet be so coy. Notwithstanding a certain fascination that it carried with it, his reflections were sombre as he went homeward. He saw how deep had been his offence to produce so great a wariness in a gentle and once unsuspicious soul. He was himself too fastidious to care to coerce her. To be an object of misgiving or dislike to a woman who shared his home was what he could not endure the thought of. Life as it stood was more tolerable. When he was gone, Marty joined Mrs. Fitzpiers. She would fain have consulted Marty on the question of platonic relations with her former husband, as she preferred to regard him. But Marty showed no great interest in her affairs, so Grace said nothing. They came onward, and saw Melbury standing at the scene of the felling which had been audible to them, when, telling Marty that she wished her meeting with Mr. Fitzpiers to be kept private, she left the girl to join her father. At any rate, she would consult him on the expediency of occasionally seeing her husband. Her father was cheerful, and walked by her side as he had done in earlier days. "I was thinking of you when you came up," he said. "I have considered that what has happened is for the best. Since your husband has gone away and seems not to wish to trouble you, why, let him go, and drop out of your life. Many women are worse off. You can live here comfortably enough, and he can emigrate or do what he likes for his good. I wouldn't mind sending him the further sum of money he might naturally expect to come to him, so that you may not be bothered with him any more. He could hardly have gone on living here without speaking to me or meeting me, and that would have been very unpleasant on both sides." These remarks checked her intention. There was a sense of weakness in following them by saying that she had just met her husband by appointment. "Then would you advise me not to communicate with him?" she observed. "I shall never advise ye again. You are your own mistress. Do as you like. But my opinion is that if you don't live with him, you had better live without him, and not go shilly-shallying and playing bo-peep. You sent him away, and now he's gone. Very well, trouble him no more." Chapter 46 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 46. The woods were uninteresting, and Grace stayed indoors a great deal. She became quite a student, reading more than she had done since her marriage, but her seclusion was always broken for the periodical visit to Winterborne's grave with Marty, which was kept up with pious strictness, for the purpose of putting snowdrops, primroses, and other vernal flowers thereon as they came. One afternoon at sunset she was standing just outside her father's garden, which, like the rest of the Hintock enclosures, abutted onto the wood. A slight footpath led along here, forming a secret way to either of the houses by getting through its boundary hedge. Grace was just about to adopt this mode of entry when a figure approached along the path and held up his hand to detain her. It was her husband. "I am delighted," he said, coming up out of breath, and there seemed no reason to doubt his words. "I saw you some way off. I was afraid you would go in before I could reach you." "It is a week before the time," she said reproachfully. "I said a fortnight from the last meeting." "My dear, you don't suppose I could wait a fortnight without trying to get a glimpse of you, even though you had declined to meet me? Would it make you angry to know that I have been along this path at dusk 3 or 4 times since our last meeting? Well, how are you?" She did not refuse her hand, but when he showed a wish to retain it a moment longer than mere formality required, she made it smaller so that it slipped away from him, with again that same alarmed look which always followed his attempts in this direction. He saw that she was not yet out of the elusive wood, not yet to be treated presumingly, and he was correspondingly careful to tranquilize her. His assertion had seemed to impress her somewhat. "I had no idea you came so often," she said. "How far do you come from?" "From Exbury. I always walk from Sherton Abbas, for if I hire, people will know that I come, and my success with you so far has not been great enough to justify such overtness. Now, my dear one, as I must call you, I put it to you, will you see me a little oftener as the spring advances?" Grace lapsed into unwonted sedateness, and, avoiding the question, said, "I wish you would concentrate on your profession, and give up those strange studies that used to distract you so much. I am sure you would get on." "It is the very thing I am doing. I was going to ask you to burn, or at least get rid of, all my philosophical literature. It is in the bookcases in your room. The fact is, I never cared much for abstruse studies." "I am glad to hear you say that. And those other books, those piles of old plays, what good are they to a medical man?" "None whatever," he replied cheerfully. "Sell them at Sherton for what they will fetch." "And those dreadful old French romances, with their horrid spellings of filz and ung and ilz and Mary and ma foi." "You haven't been reading them, Grace?" "Oh, no, I just looked into them, that was all." "Make a bonfire of them directly you get home. I meant to do it myself. I can't think what possessed me ever to collect them. I have only a few professional handbooks now, and am quite a practical man. I am in hopes of having some good news to tell you soon, and then do you think you could come to me again?" "I would rather you did not press me on that just now," she replied with some feeling. "You have said you mean to lead a new, useful, effectual life, but I should like to see you put it in practice for a little while before you address that query to me. Besides, I could not live with you." Why not? Grace was silent a few instants. I go with Marty to Giles's grave. We swore we would show him that devotion, and I mean to keep it up. Well, I wouldn't mind that at all. I have no right to expect anything else, and I will not wish you to keep away. I like the man as well as any I ever knew. In short, I would accompany you a part of the way to the place, and smoke a cigar on the stile while I waited till you came back. Then you haven't given up smoking? Well, no, I have thought of doing so, but— His extreme complacence had rather disconcerted Grace, and the question about smoking had been to effect a diversion. Presently she said firmly, and with a moisture in her eye that he could not see, as her mind returned to poor Giles's frustrate ghost, "I don't like you to speak lightly on that subject, if you did speak lightly. To be frank with you, quite frank, I think of him as my betrothed lover still. I cannot help it. So that it would be wrong for me to join you."
Fitzpiers was now uneasy. "You say your betrothed lover still," he rejoined. "When, then, were you betrothed to him, or engaged, as we common people say?"
"When you were away."
"How could that be?"
Grace would have avoided this, but her neutral candour led her on. "It was when I was under the impression that my marriage with you was about to be annulled, and then he could marry me. So I encouraged him to love me." Fitzpiers winced visibly, and yet, upon the whole, she was right in telling it. Indeed, his perception that she was right in her absolute sincerity kept up his affectionate admiration for her under the pain of the rebuff. Time had been when the avowal that Grace had deliberately taken steps to replace him would have brought him no sorrow, but she so far dominated him now that he could not bear to hear her words, although the object of her high regard was no more.
"It's rough upon me, that," he said bitterly. "Oh, Grace, I did not know you tried to get rid of me. I suppose it is of no use, but I ask, cannot you hope to find a little love in your heart for me again?"
"If I could, I would oblige you, but I fear I cannot," she replied with illogical ruefulness. "And I don't see why you should mind my having had one lover beside yourself in my life, when you have had so many. But I can tell you honestly that I love you better than all of them put together, and that's what you will not tell me." "I am sorry, but I fear I cannot," she said, sighing again.
"I wonder if you ever will." He looked musingly into her indistinct face, as if he would read the future there. "Now have pity and tell me, will you try?"
"To love you again?"
"Yes, if you can."
"I don't know how to reply," she answered, her embarrassment proving her truth. "Will you promise to leave me quite free as to seeing you or not seeing you?"
"Certainly. Have I given you any ground for you to doubt my first promise in that respect?"
She was obliged to admit that he had not.
"Then I think that you might get your heart out of that grave," said he, with playful sadness. "It has been there a long time."
She faintly shook her head, but said, "I will try to think of you more if I can."
With this, Fitzpiers was compelled to be satisfied, and he asked her when she would meet him again.
"As we arranged, in a fortnight."
"If it must be a fortnight, it must."
"This time at least. I'll consider by the day I see you again if I can shorten the interval."
"Well, be that as it may, I shall come at least twice a week to look at your window."
"You must do as you like about that. Good night."
"Say husband."
She seemed almost inclined to give him the word, but exclaiming, "No, no, I cannot," slipped through the garden hedge and disappeared.
Fitzpiers did not exaggerate when he told her that he should haunt the precincts of the dwelling, but his persistence in this course did not result in seeing her much oftener than at the fortnightly interval which she had herself marked out as proper. At these times, however, she punctually appeared, and as the spring wore on the meetings were kept up, though their character changed but little with the increase in their number. The small garden of the cottage occupied by the Tangs family, father, son, and now son's wife,
aligned with the larger one of the timber dealers at its upper end, and when young Tim, after leaving work at Melbury's, stood at dusk in the little bower at the corner of his enclosure to smoke a pipe, he frequently observed the surgeon pass along the outside track before mentioned. Fitzpiers always walked loiteringly, pensively, looking with a sharp eye into the gardens one after another as he proceeded. For Fitzpiers did not now wish to leave the absorbing spot too quickly, after travelling so far to reach it, hoping always for a glimpse of her whom he passionately desired to take to his arms anew. Now Tim began to be struck with these loitering progresses along the garden boundaries in the gloaming, and wondered what they boded. It was, naturally, quite out of his power to divine the singular sentimental revival in Fitzpiers's heart, the fineness of tissue which could take a deep, emotional, almost also an artistic pleasure in being the yearning inamorato of a woman he once had deserted, would have seemed an absurdity to the young sower. Mr. and Mrs. Fitzpiers were separated, therefore the question of affection as between them was settled. But his Suke had, since that meeting on their marriage day, repentantly admitted, to the urgency of his questioning, to a good deal concerning her past levities. Putting all things together, he could hardly avoid connecting Fitzpiers's mysterious visits to this spot with Suke's residence under his roof. But he made himself fairly easy. The vessel in which they were about to emigrate sailed that month, and then Suke would be out of Fitzpiers's way for ever. The interval at last expired, and the eve of their departure arrived. They were pausing in the room of the cottage allotted to them by Tim's father, after a busy day of preparation, which left them weary. In a corner stood their boxes, crammed and corded, their large case for the hold having already been sent away. The firelight shone upon Suke's fine face and form as she stood looking into it, and upon the face of Tim seated in a corner, and upon the walls of his father's house, which he was beholding that night almost for the last time. Tim Tangs was not happy. This scheme of emigration was dividing him from his father, for old Tangs would on no account leave Hintock, and had it not been for Suke's reputation and his own dignity, Tim would at the last moment have abandoned the project. As he sat in the back part of the room, he regarded her moodily, and the fire and the boxes. One thing he had particularly noticed this evening: she was very restless, fitful in her actions, unable to remain seated, and in a marked degree depressed. "Sorry that ye be going after all, Suke," he said. She sighed involuntarily. "I don't know but that I be," she answered. "'Tis natural, isn't it, when one is going away?" "But you wasn't born here as I was." "No." "There's folks left behind that you'd fain have with ye, I reckon." "Why do you think that?" "I've seen things and I've heard things, and, Suke, I say 'twill be a good move for me to get ye away. I don't mind his leavings abroad, but I do mind him at home." Suke's face was not changed from its aspect of listless indifference by the words. She answered nothing, and shortly afterwards he went out for his customary pipe of tobacco at the top of the garden. The restlessness of Suke had indeed owed its presence to the gentleman of Tim's suspicions, but in a different, and, it must be added in justice to her, more innocent sense than he supposed, judging from her doings. She had accidentally discovered that Fitzpiers was in the habit of coming secretly once or twice a week to Hintock, and knew that this evening was a favourite one of the 7 for his journey. As she was going next day to leave the country, Suke thought that there could be no great harm in giving way to a little sentimentality by obtaining a glimpse of him quite unknown to himself or to anybody, and thus taking a silent last farewell. Aware that Fitzpiers's time for passing was at hand, she thus betrayed her feeling. No sooner, therefore, had Tim left the room than she let herself noiselessly out of the house and hastened to the corner of the garden, whence she could witness the surgeon's transit across the scene, if he had not already gone by. Her light cotton dress was visible to Tim lounging in the arbour of the opposite corner, though he was hidden from her. He saw her stealthily climb into the hedge, and so ensconced herself there that nobody could have the least doubt her purpose was to watch unseen for a passer-by. He went across to the spot and stood behind her. Suke started, having in her blundering way forgotten that he might be near. She at once descended from the hedge. "So, he is coming to-night," said Tim laconically, "and we be always anxious to see our dears." "He is coming to-night," she replied with defiance, "and we be anxious for our dears." "Then will you step indoors, where your dear will soon join ye. We've to muster by 3:30 to-morrow, and if we don't get to bed by 8 at least, our faces will be as long as clock cases all day." She hesitated for a moment, but ultimately obeyed, going slowly down the garden to the house, where he heard the door latch click behind her. Tim was incensed beyond measure. His marriage had so far been a total failure, a source of bitter regret. The only course for improving his case, that of leaving the country, was a sorry, and possibly might not be a very effectual one. Do what he would, his domestic sky was likely to be overcast to the end of the day. Thus he brooded, and his resentment gathered force. He craved a means of striking one blow back at the cause of his cheerless plight, while he was still on the scene of his discomfiture. For some minutes no method suggested itself, and then he had an idea. Coming to a sudden resolution, he hastened along the garden, and entered the one attached to the next cottage, which had formerly been the dwelling of a gamekeeper. Tim descended the path to the back of the house, where only an old woman lived at present, and reaching the wall he stopped. Owing to the slope of the ground, the roof eaves of the linhay were within touch, and he thrust his arm up under them, feeling about in the space on the top of the wall plate. "Ah, I thought my memory didn't deceive me," he lipped silently. With some exertion he drew down a cobwebbed object, curiously framed in iron, which clanked as he moved it. It was about 3 feet in length and half as wide. Tim contemplated it as well as he could in the dying light of day, and raked off the cobwebs with his hand. Chapter 47 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 47. Were the inventors of automatic machines to be ranged according to the excellence of their devices for producing sound artistic torture, the creator of the man-trap would occupy a very respectable, if not a very high place. It should rather, however, be said, the inventor of the particular form of man-trap of which this found in the keeper's outhouse was a specimen. For there were other shapes and other sizes, instruments which, if placed in a row beside one of the type disinterred by Tim, would have worn the subordinate aspects of the bears, wild boars, or wolves in a travelling menagerie, as compared with the leading lion or tiger. In short, though many varieties had been in use during those centuries which we are accustomed to look back upon as the true and only period of merry England, in the rural districts more especially, and onward down to the 3rd decade of the 19th century, this model had borne the palm, and had been most usually followed when the orchards and estates required new ones. There had been the toothless variety used by the softer-hearted landlords, quite contemptible in their clemency. The jaws of these resembled the jaws of an old woman, to whom time has left nothing but gums. There were also the intermediate or half-toothed sorts, probably devised by the middle-natured squires, or those under the influence of their wives. 2 inches of mercy, 2 inches of cruelty, 2 inches of mere nip, 2 inches of probe, and so on, through the whole extent of the jaws. There were also, as a class apart, the bruisers, which did not lacerate the flesh, but only crushed the bone. The sight of one of these gins when set produced a vivid impression that it was endowed with life.
It exhibited the combined aspects of a shark, a crocodile, and a scorpion. Each tooth was in the form of a tapering spine, 2¼ inches long, which, when the jaws were closed, stood in alternation from this side and from that. When they were open, the two halves formed a complete circle, between 2 and 3 feet in diameter, the plate or treading place in the midst being about a foot square, while from beneath extended in opposite directions the soul of the apparatus, a pair of springs, each one being of a stiffness to render necessary a lever or the whole weight of the body when forcing it down. There were men at this time still living at Hintock, who remembered when the gin and others like it were in use. Tim Tangs's great uncle had endured a night of 6 hours in this very trap, which lamed him for life. Once a keeper of Hintock Woods set it on the track of a poacher, and afterwards, coming back that way, forgetful of what he had done, walked into it himself. The wound brought on lockjaw, of which he died. This event occurred during the 30s, and by the year 1840 the use of such implements was well nigh discontinued in the neighbourhood. But being made entirely of iron, they by no means disappeared, and in almost every village one could be found in some nook or corner as readily as this was found by Tim. It had, indeed, been a fearful amusement of Tim and other Hintock lads, especially those who had a dim sense of becoming renowned poachers when they reached their prime, to drag out this trap from its hiding, set it, and throw it with billets of wood, which were penetrated by the teeth to the depth of near an inch. As soon as he had examined the trap, and found that the hinges and springs were still perfect, he shouldered it without more ado, and returned with his burden to his own garden, passing on through the hedge to the path immediately outside the boundary. Here, by the help of a stout stake, he set the trap, and laid it carefully behind a bush while he went forward to reconnoitre. As had been stated, nobody passed this way for days together sometimes, but there was just a possibility that some other pedestrian than the one in request might arrive, and it behoved Tim to be careful as to the identity of his victim. Going about 100 yards along the rising ground to the right, he reached a ridge whereon a large and thick holly grew. Beyond this, for some distance, the wood was more open, and the course which Fitzpiers must pursue to reach the point, if he came to-night, was visible a long way forward. For some time there was no sign of him or anybody. Then there shaped itself a spot out of the dim mid-distance, between the masses of brushwood on either hand, and it enlarged, and Tim could hear the brushing of feet over the tufts of sour grass. The airy gate revealed Fitzpiers even before his exact outline could be seen. Tim Tangs turned about and ran down the opposite side of the hill, till he was again at the head of his own garden. It was the work of a few moments to drag out the man-trap, very gently, that the plate might not be disturbed sufficiently to throw it, to a space between a pair of young oaks, which, rooted in contiguity, grew apart upward, forming a V-shaped opening between, and, being backed up by bushes, left this as the only course for a foot-passenger. In it he laid the trap with the same gentleness of handling, locked the chain round one of the trees, and finally slid back the guard which was placed to keep the gin from accidentally catching the arms of him who set it, or, to use a local and better word, toiled it. Having completed these arrangements, Tim sprang through the adjoining hedge of his father's garden, ran down the path, and softly entered the house. Obedient to his order, Suke had gone to bed, and as soon as he had bolted the door, Tim unlaced and kicked off his boots at the foot of the stairs, and retired likewise, without lighting a candle. His object seemed to be to undress as soon as possible. Before, however, he had completed the operation, a long cry resounded without, penetrating but indescribable. "What is that?" said Suke, starting up in bed. "It sounds as if somebody has caught a hare in his gin." "Oh, no," she said. "It was not a hare. 'Twas louder. Hark!" "Do 'ee get to sleep," said Tim. "How be you going to wake at 3:30 else?" She lay down and was silent. Tim stealthily opened the window and listened.
Above the low harmonies produced by the instrumentation of the various species of trees around the premises he could hear the twitching of a chain from the spot whereon he had set the man-trap, but further human sound there was none. Tim was puzzled. In the haste of his project he had not calculated upon a cry, but if one, why not more? He soon ceased to essay an answer, for Hintock was dead to him already. In half a dozen hours he would be out of its precincts for life, on his way to the Antipodes. He closed the window and lay down. The hour which had brought these movements of Tim to birth had been operating actively elsewhere. Awaiting in her father's house the minute of her appointment with her husband, Grace Fitzpiers deliberated on many things. Should she inform her father before going out that the estrangement of herself and Edgar was not so complete as he had imagined, and deemed desirable for her happiness? If she did, so she must in some measure become the apologist for her husband, and she was not prepared to go that far. As for him, he kept her in a mood of considerate gravity. He certainly had changed. He had, at his worst times, always been gentle in his manner towards her. Could it be that she might make of him a true and worthy husband yet? She had married him, there was no getting over that, and ought she any longer to keep him at a distance? His suave deference to her lightest whim on the question of his comings and goings, when as her husband he might show a little independence, was a trait in his character as unexpected as it was engaging. If she had been his empress, and he the thrall, he could not have exhibited a more sensitive care to avoid intruding upon her against her will. Impelled by a remembrance, she took down a prayer-book and turned to the marriage service. Reading it slowly through, she became quite appalled at her recent off-handedness, when she discovered what awfully solemn promise she had made to him at those chancel steps not so very long ago. She became lost in long ponderings on how far a person's conscience might be bound by vows made without at the time full recognition of their force. That particular sentence beginning, "Whom God hath joined together," was a staggerer for a gentlewoman of strong devotional sentiment. She wondered whether God really did join them together. Before she had done deliberating, the time of her engagement drew near, and she went out of the house almost at the moment that Tim Tangs retired to his own. The position of things at that critical juncture was briefly as follows. 200 yards to the right of the upper end of Tang's garden, Fitzpiers was still advancing, having now nearly reached the summit of the wood-clothed ridge, the path being the actual one which further on passed between the two young oaks. Thus far it was according to Tim's conjecture. But about 200 yards to the left, or rather less, was arising a condition which he had not divined: the emergence of Grace as aforesaid from the upper corner of her father's garden, with the view of meeting Tim's intended victim. Midway between husband and wife was the diabolical trap, silent, open, ready. Fitzpiers's walk that night had been cheerful, for he was convinced that the slow and gentle method he had adopted was promising success. The very restraint that he was obliged to exercise upon himself, so as not to kill the delicate bud of returning confidence, fed his flame. He walked so much more rapidly than Grace that, if they continued advancing as they had begun, he would reach the trap a good half-minute before she could reach the same spot. But here a new circumstance came in. To escape the unpleasantness of being watched or listened to by lurkers, naturally curious by reason of their strained relations, they had arranged that their meeting for tonight should be at the holm-tree on the ridge above named. So soon, accordingly, as Fitzpiers reached the tree, he stood still to await her. He had not paused under the prickly foliage more than 2 minutes, when he thought he heard a scream from the other side of the ridge. Fitzpiers wondered what it could mean, but such wind as there was just now blew in an adverse direction, and his mood was light. He set down the origin of the sound to one of the superstitious freaks or frolicsome skirmishes between sweethearts that still survived in Hintock from old English times, and waited on where he stood till 10 minutes had passed. Feeling then a little uneasy, his mind reverted to the scream, and he went over the summit and down the embowered incline, till he reached the pair of sister oaks with the narrow opening between them. Fitzpiers stumbled and all but fell. Stretching out his hand to ascertain the obstruction, it came in contact with a confused mass of silken drapery and ironwork that conveyed absolutely no explanatory idea to his mind at all. It was but the work of a moment to strike a match, and then he saw a sight which congealed his blood. The man-trap was thrown, and between its jaws was part of a woman's clothing, a patterned silk skirt, gripped in such violence that the iron teeth had passed through it, skewering its tissue in a score of places. He immediately recognized the skirt as that of one of his wife's gowns, the gown that she had worn when she met him on the very last occasion. Fitzpiers had often studied the effect of these instruments when examining the collection at Hintock House, and the conception instantly flashed through him that Grace had been caught, taken out mangled by some chance passer and carried home, some of her clothes being left behind in the difficulty of getting her free. The shock of this conviction, striking into the very current of high hope, was so great that he cried out like one in corporeal agony, and in his misery bowed himself down to the ground. Of all the degrees and qualities of punishment that Fitzpiers had undergone since his sins against Grace first began, not any even approximated in intensity to this. "Oh, my own, my darling! Oh, cruel heaven, it is too much, this!" he cried, writhing and rocking himself over the sorry accessories of her he adored. The voice of his distress was sufficiently loud to be audible to anyone who might have been there to hear it, and one there was. Right and left of the narrow pass between the oaks were dense bushes, and now from behind these a female figure glided, whose appearance even in the gloom was, though graceful in outline, noticeably strange. She was in white up to the waist, and figured above. She was, in short, Grace, his wife, lacking the portion of her dress which the gin retained. "Don't be grieved about me, don't, Edgar dear," she exclaimed, rushing up and bending over him. "I am not hurt a bit. I was coming out to find you after I had released myself, but I heard footsteps and I hid away, because I was without some of my clothing and I did not know who the person might be." Fitzpiers had sprung to his feet, and his next act was no less unpremeditated by him than it was irresistible by her, and would have been so by any woman not of Amazonian strength. He clasped his arms completely around her, pressed her to his breast, and kissed her passionately. "You are not dead! You are not hurt! Thank God! Thank God!" he said, almost sobbing in his delight and relief from the horror of his apprehension. "Grace, my wife, my love, how is this? What has happened?" "I was coming to you," she said as distinctly as she could in the half-smothered state of her face against his. "I was trying to be as punctual as possible, and as I had started a minute late, I ran along the path very swiftly, fortunately for myself. Just when I passed between the trees I felt something clutch at my dress from behind with a noise, and the next moment I was pulled backward by it and fell to the ground. I screamed with terror, thinking it was a man lying down there to murder me, but the next moment I discovered it was iron, and that my clothes were caught in a trap. I pulled this way and that, but the thing would not let go, drag it as I would, and I did not know what to do. I did not want to alarm my father or anybody, as I wished nobody to know of these meetings with you, so I could think of no other plan than slipping off my skirt, meaning to run on and tell you what a strange accident had happened to me. But when I had just freed myself by leaving the dress behind, I heard steps, and not being sure it was you, I did not like to be seen in such a pickle, so I hid away." "It was only your speed that saved you. One or both of your legs would have been broken if you had come at ordinary walking pace." "Or yours, if you had got here first," said she, beginning to realize the whole ghastliness of the possibility. "Oh, Edgar, there has been an eye watching over us tonight, and we should be thankful indeed." He continued to press his face to hers. "You are mine again now." She gently owned that she supposed she was. "I heard what you said when you thought I was injured," she went on shyly, "and I know that a man who could suffer as you were suffering must have a tender regard for me. But how does this awful thing come here?" "I suppose it has something to do with poachers." Fitzpiers was still so shaken by the sense of her danger that he was obliged to sit a while, and it was not until Grace said, If I could only get my skirt out, nobody would know anything about it, that he bestirred himself. By their united efforts, each standing on one of the springs of the trap, they pressed him down sufficiently to insert across the jaws a billet which they dragged from a faggot near at hand, and it was then possible to extract the silk mouthful from the monster's bite, creased and pierced with many holes, but not torn. Fitzpiers assisted her to put it on again, and when her customary contours were thus restored they walked on together, Grace taking his arm, till he effected an improvement by clasping it around her waist. The ice having been broken in this unexpected manner, she made no further attempt at reserve. "I would ask you to come into the house," she said, "but my meetings with you have been kept secret from my father, and I should like to prepare him." "Never mind, dearest. I could not very well have accepted the invitation. I shall never live here again, as much for your sake as for mine. I had news to tell you on this very point, but my alarm had put it out of my head. I have bought a practice, or rather a partnership, in the Midlands, and I must go there in a week to take up my permanent residence. My poor old great-aunt died about 8 months ago, and left me enough to do this. I have taken a little furnished house for a time, till we can get one of our own." He described the place and the surroundings, and the view from the windows, and Grace became much interested. "But why are you not there now?" she said. "Because I cannot tear myself away from here till I have your promise. Now, darling, you will accompany me there, will you not? To-night has settled that." Grace's tremblings had gone off, and she did not say nay. They went on together. The adventure and the emotions consequent upon the reunion which that event had forced on combined to render Grace oblivious of the direction of the desultory ramble, till she noticed that they were in an encircling glade in the densest part of the wood, whereon the moon that had imperceptibly added its rays to the scene shone almost vertically. It was an exceptionally soft, balmy evening for the time of year, and was just at that transient period in the May month when the beech trees had suddenly unfolded large limp young leaves of the softness of butterflies' wings. Boughs bearing such leaves hung low around and completely enclosed them, so that it was as if they were in a great green vase, which had moss for its bottom and leaf sides. The clouds having been packed in the west that evening so as to retain the departing glare a long while, the hour had seemed much earlier than it was, but suddenly the question of time occurred to her. "I must go back," she said without further delay, as they set their faces toward Hintock. As they walked he examined his watch by the aid of the now strong moonlight. "By the gods, I think I have lost my train," said Fitzpiers. "Dear me, whereabouts are we?" said she. 2 miles in the direction of Sherton." "Then do you hasten on, Edgar. I am not in the least afraid. I recognize now the part of the wood we are in, and I can find my way back quite easily. I'll tell my father we have made it up. I wish I had not kept our meeting so private, for it may vex him a little to know I have been seeing you. He has been getting old and irritable. That is why I did not. Good-bye." "But as I must stay at the Earl of Wessex to-night, for I cannot possibly catch the train, I think it would be safer for you to let me take care of you." "But what will my father think has become of me? He does not know in the least where I am. He thinks I only went into the garden for a few minutes." "He will surely guess. Somebody has seen me for certain. I shall go all the way back with you tomorrow." "But that newly done-up place, the Earl of Wessex?" "If you are so very particular about the publicity, I will stay at the Tree Top." Chapter 48 of the Woodlanders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 48. All the evening Melbury had been coming to his door, saying, "I wonder where in the world that girl is. Never in all my born days did I know her to bide out like this. Surely she said she was going into the garden to get some parsley."
Melbury searched the garden, the parsley bed, and the orchard, but could find no trace of her, and then he made inquiries at the cottages of such of his workmen as had not gone to bed, avoiding Tang's because he knew the young people were to rise early to leave. In these inquiries one of the men's wives somewhat incautiously let out the fact that she had heard a scream in the wood, though from which direction she could not say. This set Melbury's fears on end. He told the men to light lanterns, and, headed by himself, they started, Creedle following at the last moment with quite a burden of grapnels and ropes, which he could not be persuaded to leave behind, and the company being joined by the hollow turner and the man who kept the cider house as they went along. They explored the precincts of the village, and in a short time lighted upon the man-trap. This discovery simply added an item of fact without helping their conjectures, but Melbury's indefinite alarm was greatly increased when, holding a candle to the ground, he saw in the teeth of the instrument some frayings from Grace's clothing. No intelligence of any kind was gained till they met a woodman from Delborough, who said that he had seen a lady answering to the description her father gave of Grace, walking through the wood on a gentleman's arm in the direction of Sherton. "Was he clutching her tight?" said Melbury. "Well, rather," said the man. "Did she walk lame?" "Well, 'tis true her head hung over towards him a bit." Creedle groaned tragically. Melbury, not suspecting the presence of Fitzpiers, coupled this account with the man-trap and the scream. He could not understand what it all meant, but the sinister event of the trap made him follow on. Accordingly they bore away towards the town, shouting as they went, and in due course emerged upon the highway. Nearing Sherton Abbas, the previous information was confirmed by other strollers, though the gentleman's supporting arm had disappeared from these later accounts. At last they were so near to Sherton that Melbury informed his faithful followers that he did not wish to drag them farther at so late an hour, since he could go on alone and inquire if the woman who had been seen really were Grace. But they would not leave him alone in his anxiety, and trudged onward till the lamplight from the town began to illuminate their fronts. At the entrance to the High Street they got fresh scent of the pursued, but coupled with the new condition that the lady in the costume described had been going up the street alone. "Faith, I believe she's mesmerized, or walking in her sleep," said Melbury. However, the identity of this woman with Grace was by no means certain, but they plodded along the street. Percombe, the hairdresser, who had despoiled Marty of her tresses, was standing at his door, and they duly put inquiries to him. "Ah, how's the little Hintock folk by now?" he said before replying. "Never have I been over there since one winter night some 3 years ago, and then I lost myself in finding it. How can you live in such a one-eyed place? Great Hintock is bad enough, but Little Hintock, the bats and owls would drive me melancholy mad. It took 2 days to raise me spirits to their true pitch again after that night I went there. Mr. Melbury, sir, as a man that's put money by, why not retire and live here and see something of the world?" The responses at last given by him to their queries guided them to the building that offered the best accommodation in Sherton, having been enlarged contemporaneously with the construction of the railway, namely the Earl of Wessex Hotel. Leaving the others without, Melbury made prompt inquiry here. His alarm was lessened, though his perplexity was increased when he received a brief reply that such a lady was in the house. "Do you know if it's my daughter?" asked Melbury. The waiter did not. "Do you know the lady's name?" Of this, too, the household was ignorant, the hotel having been taken by brand-new people from a distance. They knew the gentleman very well by sight, and had not thought it necessary to ask him to enter his name. "Oh, the gentleman appears again now," said Melbury to himself. "Well, I want to see the lady," he declared. A message was taken up, and after some delay the shape of Grace appeared descending round the bend of the staircase, looking as if she lived there, but in other respects rather guilty and frightened. "Why, what the name?" began her father. "I thought you went out to get parsley." "Oh yes, I did, but it is all right," said Grace in a flurried whisper. "I am not alone here. I am here with Edgar. It is entirely owing to an accident, father. Edgar? An accident? How does he come here? I thought he was 200 miles off.
Yes, so he is. I mean, he has got a beautiful practice 200 miles off. He has bought it with his own money, some that came to him. But he travelled here, and I was nearly caught in a man-trap. And that's how it is I am here. We were just thinking of sending a messenger to let you know. Melbury did not seem to be particularly enlightened by this explanation.
You were caught in a man-trap?
Yes, my dress was. That's how it arose. Edgar is upstairs in his own sitting-room, she went on. He would not mind seeing you, I'm sure.
Oh, faith, I don't want to see him. I have seen him too often already. I'll see him another time, perhaps, if it's to oblige ye.
He came to see me. He wanted to consult me about this large partnership I speak of, as it is very promising.
Oh, I am glad to hear it, said Melbury dryly.
A pause ensued, during which the inquiring faces and whitey-brown clothes of Melbury's companions appeared in the doorway.
Then bain't you coming home with us? He asked.
I think not, said Grace, blushing.
Ah, very well. You are your own mistress,
he returned in tones which seemed to assert otherwise.
Good night. And Melbury retreated towards the door.
Don't be angry, father, she said, following him a few steps. I have done it for the best.
I am not angry, though it is true I have been a little misled in this. However, good night. I must get home along.
He left the hotel, not without relief, for to be under the eyes of strangers while he conversed with his lost child had embarrassed him much. His search party, too, had looked awkward here, having rushed to the task of investigation, some in their shirt-sleeves, others in their leather aprons, and all much stained, just as they had come from their work of barking, and not in their Sherton-marketing attire, while Creedle, with his ropes and grapnels and air of impending tragedy, had added melancholy to gawkiness.
"Now, neighbours," said Melbury on joining them, "as it is getting late, we'll leg it home again as fast as we can. I ought to tell you that there has been some mistake, some arrangement entered into between Mr. and Mrs. Fitzpiers which I didn't quite understand. An important practice in the Midland counties has come to him, which made it necessary for her to join him tonight, so she says. That's all it was, and I'm sorry I dragged you out."
"Well," said the hollow turner,
"here be we 6 miles from home, and night time, and not a hoss or 4-footed creeping thing to her name. I say we'll have a mossel and a drop of summat to strengthen our nerves before we vamp all the way back again. My throat's as dry as a kex. What do you say, so's?"
They all concurred in the need for this course, and proceeded to the antique and lampless back street, in which the red curtain of the 3 tons was the only radiant object. As soon as they had stumbled down into the room, Melbury ordered them to be served, when they made themselves comfortable by the long table, and stretched out their legs upon the herringbone sand of the floor. Melbury himself, restless as usual, walked to the door while he waited for them, and looked up and down the street.
"I'd gie her a good shake if she were my maid, pretending to go out in the garden, and leading folk a 12-mile trapes that have got to get up at 5 o'clock tomorrow," said a bark-ripper who, not working regularly for Melbury, could afford to indulge in strong opinions. "I don't speak so warm as that," said the hollow turner, "but if 'tis right for couples to make a country talk about their separating, and excite the neighbours, and then make fools of 'em like this, why, I haven't stood upon one leg for 25 year." All his listeners knew that when he alluded to his foot-lathe in these enigmatic terms, the speaker meant to be impressive, and Creedle chimed in with, "Ah, young women do wax wanton in these days. Why couldn't she have bode with her father, and been faithful?" Poor Creedle was thinking of his old employer. "But this deceiving of folks is nothing unusual in matrimony," said Farmer Bawtree. "I knowed a man and a wife, faith, I don't mind owning, as there's no strangers here, that the pair were my own relations. They'd be at it that hot 1 hour that you'd hear the poker and the tongs and the bellows and the warming pan flee across the house with the movements of their vengeance, and the next hour you'd hear 'em singing the spotted cow together as peaceable as two holy twins. Yes, and very good voices they had, and would strike in like professional ballad singers to one another's support in the high notes. And I know the woman, and the husband of her went away for 24 year, said the bark ripper, and one night he came home when she was sitting by the fire, and thereupon he sat down himself on the other side in the chimney corner. Well, says she, have you any news? I don't know as I have, says he. Have you? No, says she, except that my daughter by my second husband was married last month, which was a year after I was made a widow by him. Oh, anything else, says he. No, says she. And there they sat, one on each side of the chimney corner, and were found by the neighbours sound asleep in their chairs, not having known what to talk about at all. Well, I don't care who the man is, said Creedle. They required a good deal to talk about, and that's true. It won't be the same with these. He's such a project, you see, and she's such a wonderful scholar, too. What women do know nowadays, observed the hollow turner. You can't deceive them as you could do in my time. What they know then was not small, said John Upjohn. Always a good deal more than the men. Why, when I was courting my wife that is now, the skilfulness that she would show in keeping me on her pretty side as she walked was beyond all belief. Perhaps you've noticed that she's got a pretty side to her face as well as a plain one. I can't say I've noticed it in particular much, said the hollow turner blandly. Well, continued Upjohn, not disconcerted, she has. All women under the sun be prettier one side than t'other, and, as I was saying, the pains she would take to make me walk on her pretty side were unending. I warrant that whether she were going with the sun or against the sun, uphill or downhill, in the wind or the lute, that wart of hers was always toward the hedge, and that dimple towards me. There was I, too simple to see her wheelings and turnings, and she so artful, though 2 years younger, that she could lead me with a cotton thread, like a blind ram, for that was in the 3rd climate of our courtship. No, I don't think women have got cleverer, for they was never otherwise. How many climates may there be in courtship, Mr. Upjohn? inquired a youth, the same who had assisted at Winterborne's Christmas party. 5, from the coldest to the hottest. Leastwise, there was 5 in mine. Can you give us a chronicle of them, Mr. Upjohn? Yes, I could certainly, but 'tis quite unnecessary. They'll come to you by nature, young man, too soon for your own good. At present Mrs. Fitzpiers can lead the doctor as your missus could lead you, the hollow turner remarked. She's got him quite tame. But how long 'twill last I can't say. I happened to be setting a wire in the top of my garden one night when he met her on the other side of the hedge, and the way she queened it and fenced and kept that poor feller at a distance was enough to freeze your blood. I should never have supposed it of such a girl. Melbury now returned into the room, and the men having declared themselves refreshed, they all started on the homeward journey, which was by no means cheerless under the rays of the high moon. Having to walk the whole distance, they came by a footpath rather shorter than the highway, though difficult except to those who knew the country well. This brought them by way of Great Hintock, and passing the churchyard they observed as they walked a motionless figure standing by the gate. "I think it was Marty South," said the hollow turner parenthetically. "I think it was. I was always a lonely maid," said Upjohn, and they passed on homeward and thought of the matter no more. It was Marty, as they had supposed. That evening had been the particular one of the week upon which Grace and herself had been accustomed to privately deposit flowers on Giles's grave, and this was the first occasion since his death 8 months earlier on which Grace had failed to keep her appointment. Marty had waited in the road just outside Little Hintock, where her fellow pilgrim had been wont to join her, till she was weary, and at last, thinking that Grace had missed her and gone on alone, she followed the way to Great Hintock, but saw no Grace in front of her. It got later, and Marty continued her walk till she reached the churchyard gate, but still no Grace.
Yet her sense of comradeship would not allow her to go on to the grave alone, and still thinking the delay had been unavoidable, she stood there with her little basket of flowers in her clasped hands, and her feet chilled by the damp ground, till more than 2 hours had passed. She then heard the footsteps of Melbury's men, who presently passed on their return from the search. In the silence of the night Marty could not help hearing fragments of their conversation, from which she acquired a general idea of what had occurred, and where Mrs. Fitzpiers then was. Immediately they had dropped down the hill she entered the churchyard, going to a secluded corner behind the bushes, where rose the unadorned stone that marked the last bed of Giles Winterborne. As this solitary and silent girl stood there in the moonlight, a straight, slim figure, clothed in a plaitless gown, the contours of womanhood so undeveloped as to be scarcely perceptible, the marks of poverty and toil effaced by the misty hour, she touched sublimity at points, and looked almost like a being who had rejected with indifference the attribute of sex for the loftier quality of abstract humanism. She stooped down and cleared away the withered flowers that Grace had herself laid there the previous week, and put her fresh ones in their place. "Now, my own love," she whispered, "you are mine and only mine, for she has forgot ye at last, although for her you died. But I, whenever I get up, I'll think of ye, and whenever I lie down, I'll think of ye. Whenever I plant the young larches, I'll think that none can ever plant as you planted. And whenever I split a gad, and whenever I turn the cider ring, I'll say no one could do it like you. If I ever forget your name, let me forget home and heaven. But no, my love, I can never forget ye, for you was a good man, and did good things."